Snow fell in a hush that swallowed the cries of dying men. The god's wood of Winterfell wore a skin of white so thick that the red leaves under which Bran Stark waited were glazed as if in sugar. Each fingered frond a motionless tongue. It was beautiful in the way a graveyard is beautiful under a first snowfall, because beauty and silence share a parentage with the end of things. Theon Greyjoy tasted iron through the scarf of his breath as the dead came through the trees. Their feet made no sound. The sound was all the living. The scrape of Theon's boot when he shifted his weight, the ghost rattle of his bowstring when he eased it from its tension, the thud of his heart that he told himself was just a drum to keep him brave. Behind him, Bran sat motionless beneath the heart tree, and ravens perched temple-black along the branches as if the bark itself had sprouted eyes. "Don't run," Theon whispered, a prayer cast forward and backward both. He thought of the boys he had pretended to kill, of the boys he had betrayed, and of a boy he had once been. He thought of his father's hall and the stench of pitch and salt. He thought, briefly, treacherously, of a fire-warmed bed in the Red Keep that had never been his. Then he thought of nothing but the cold, and the tall figure moving among the white trunks with the patience of an old, unanswerable truth. The Night King wore unmelting frost-like armor and walked as a man might walk through his garden at dusk, certain every path would take him where he intended to go. Around him the wind dimmed to a listening. Closer, and Theon saw the knife of blue within the eyes. Not a color, but a place. Behind that place, he knew, hung the night sky of a season without end. He pulled loosed. The arrows were good northern make, fletched by a hand that understood winter, and they punched into dead things with honest thumps and shudders. Wights fell and rose on their broken legs, hands clubbing saplings as they staggered forward to pull the shafts free. Theon reached for another arrow and found none. He laughed before he could stop himself. "We're out," he said to Bran, and the boy in the chair looked at him without looking at him at all. "I'm going to go now." Bran blinked slowly. "You're a good man, Theon." It was both absolution and gallows sentence, and Theon had learned how to receive both. He ran, not away. He ran in the only sensible direction left, straight at the thing that had come to end him. There was grace in it. He'd never been as good at anything as he was at this one last choice. He had always been 2 men or 4 or none. Now he was a single blade, and the blade had a name and a destination. The spear he had plucked from the snow was dragonglass and dark as wet crow feathers. It hummed as he leveled it at the Pale King's ribs. The humming stopped when gloved fingers closed around the shaft. The Night King did not wrench the spear away. He simply held it until the heat of Theon's hands cut into the chill and the black glass shrieked. Cracks ran like lightning through it. It did not shatter. It dissolved, trickling away into a drift of shining sand that the wind lifted and scattered amid the tree roots. Theon stumbled. The armored hand rested against his breastbone with a lightness that would have made a lover jealous. The cold went all the way through him, and he knew with a calmness that astonished him that he had always been moving toward this, step by step, choice by choice, as if the world had been a map and he had come at last to the place marked only by an X and a skull. He swallowed, found there was no saliva left to swallow, and reached for the sword he did not have. The gloved hand did not push. It only remained. Theon Greyjoy fell backward into snow that had not been there a heartbeat before, and the snow accepted him the way sea accepts a stone. The Night King moved away without any change of pace or gaze. He came to the boy in the chair and the tree with a face. The face wept red sap and looked down in carved and blind sorrow, as if it knew this meeting for what it was and could not do anything but witness it. Bran's eyes were gray and vast and far. When they returned to the world, they came with wings. Ravens burst from the branches as if the heart tree had decided suddenly that it had borne enough. They flew at the Night King, black knives of noise. Their beaks scored ice and their cries dug at the ear, and their bodies burst into ash when they touched his skin. Ash fell in lazy spirals on Bran's shoulders and in his hair. More ravens came. More ash, more silence. "Come on," a voice breathed behind a trunk. The girl had a blade at her palm, and blood beaded along the edge as if the steel had decided to suckle. She tasted the iron and went to air, to shadow, to the place where she had learned to be smaller than a wind and sharper than a hinge. Arya Stark moved as water does in winter when it wants to be ice and river both, and the world narrowed to the gap between two plates of armor, to the soft place beneath the jaw. The leap was perfect. The moment was perfect. The dagger struck a pressure you could not see but could feel in the spine and the teeth. It slid a hair and the hair snapped. Then the world flowed the other way. Blue fingers closed on Arya's wrist above the blade, and the strength there was not brute so much as inexorable. She felt her bones ring as if someone had flicked them. She dropped the dagger because she could not help it. He did not catch it. He could have. It fell point first into the snow with a sound that was almost a note. Arya kicked. He could have broken her. He did not. He pressed and lifted and hung her in the air until her boots lost their need for ground. She saw herself reflected in his eyes. Pale, small, her face all wolf and nothing else. She tried to spit and found her lips stuck to her teeth. Her vision went white around the edges, as the world does when you drown. Then he was no longer holding her, and she fell. He had not thrown her far. He had not needed to throw her at all. She scrambled backward, hand seeking the dagger, and came away with a handful of snow. When she looked up, the Night King had already turned his back to her. He put his palm against Bran Stark's chest, and frost fanned outward through wool and skin like a flower. The sound it made was not cracking. It was closer to breath on glass. Bran's gaze didn't flinch, deepened. Arya saw the blue reflected in Bran's eyes widen, then collapse to points like stars you can see only out of the corner of your sight. The ravens quit the branches as if a bell had been rung in a frequency only they knew. Bran closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were Bran's eyes, gray and human and full of a grief that had no words. Snow powdered his lashes. He smiled, a small, boyish thing that did not belong in that place, and his head dropped with such gentle exhaustion that Arya thought, wholly irrationally, that he had fallen asleep. The Night King did not look at her again. He turned, and the army behind him moved as a single organism might move, bending itself around trunks and stones, flowing toward the breach in Winterfell's wall. The gods would breathed out a final warm ghost of life, and it was gone. Later she would think that was when winter truly began, not when the wall fell, not when dead fingers first touched human throats in the north, but when the boy beneath the heart tree went away where even she could not follow. The moon rolled behind Scud. The cold reached the marrow of the keep and drank. In the courtyards, unslept men and women cut and screamed and died. They died the way mortals die, in filth and noise, and then they rose the way water rises when pulled by the moon. Jon Snow fought until the knuckles of his sword hand cracked inside his glove, until the taste of smoke had become his tongue. The air shook when dragons tore across it. He looked up once and saw fire pour over the figure that had killed his brother in all the ways that mattered. Heat drove the snow to steam in curtains. The shape inside the fire did not shift. The spear sang. Regal shrieked and went down into the dark in a tangle of wings. Jon's gaze found Daenerys, and for a heartbeat there was no sound. She had eyes that could not quite forgive the world for what it had done to her and was doing still. Drogon beat his wings and the snow under him skated away, revealing the stones of Winterfell's outer yard like bones. She turned, and for something like a prayer, Jon saw in her face not a queen, not a conqueror, but a woman who held to one need like a rope. It was not a need to rule. It was the need not to lose. "Go," he shouted, and she could not hear him, and she went. Drogon rose, claws raking the air, and arrow fire stitched the night beneath them like a signature that only the dead read. They did not win. There is no music in saying so. Even victories are only pauses between griefs. This was not even that. The living retreated down their own stone guts, through corridors that had heard boy footfall and summer laughter, through rooms where the dead stood up with knives of ice in their hands. Sansa led those who could be led. She took Tyrion's hand because there was no longer any reason not to, and because hands, in the end, are what people have to give each other. In the crypts, old kings had joined the fight and had to be killed again. The logic of it was a neat ring that would have been funny if it had not been happening to them. They left Winterfell burning the way a coal burns in a windless room. A steady glow, no flame. The glow traveled as the army traveled. It left no light behind it. By morning, those who had lived were either south of the ruins or part of the host that wore those ruins like a cape. A white dawn came up. It never quite left. The sun learned the trick of lingering behind cloud. On a pier at White Harbor where snow turned masts into white-limbed forests, Davos Seaworth counted bodies off a ship because there were no coppers left to pay passage and numbers were what there were to keep. He blinked hard when he found the face he had been looking for and finding had feared most to find. Arya was not dead, not entirely. She was small under the blanket and more bones than a girl had any right to own. Gendry carried her ashore, his face the color iron goes when it has been too long at quench. She slept with the dagger in her hand, and those who had seen what it had done before did not ask her to put it aside. Jon came with Ghost at his hip and a quiet that fit him like an old cloak. Daenerys came with dragons and soldiers and the last dregs of a plan that had seemed so possible so very recently. Tyrion came with the self that remained after a long accounting, and Sansa came with the rest of the North's future in a striking cloak, chin lifted against a wind that would only ever get worse. Brienne was a wall that walked, Podrick, a shadow that stood close to it. Missandei wrapped bandages with a kindness that did not waver, and Grey Worm counted the Unsullied and counted them again until the number refused to change and he put the tally away because grief had its own arithmetic and did not need his. They sailed. There is a particular silence on the narrow sea in winter. Nogals. The water sloughed past hulls like something alive that had chosen to be indifferent for a time. Davos watched the cliff spine of Dragonstone thrust up out of the spindrift with the relief of a sinner sighting a chapel light. Volcanic warmth lived under that black tooth. It smoked even now, a lazy coil of breath that said not all fires had consented to go out. Refuge was a word that must be used carefully. Dragonstone did what it was built to do. It turned away the first rush of winter and made a hearth where the shivering could gather. Around the table carved as a map of the realm whose fates they no longer directed, they set out bread and the last of the summer apples, wrinkled and sweet. Daenerys laid her palm where the dragon's shadow cut across the painted grass of the reach, and her eyes tracked the curve of the Blackwater. "He'll go there," she said, and no one asked who she meant. "Cersei will not bend to him. She will believe she can bargain. She will mistake this for a politics." Tyrion said, "She has made a career of that mistake." "And you?" Sansa asked him. "What career will you make now?" He lifted a cup and found he did not want what was in it. "Accounting," he said. "It seems I was born to tally debts I cannot pay." Samwell Tarly arrived on the third day with Gilly and the babe and a satchel full of careful, foolish hope. Old Town had not fallen. Old Town had turned inward and counted its candles and locked its doors. The citadel hummed like a hive under frost, and he had come away with 2 books and a sheaf of notes and a memory of a black candle steady in a hand older than any he had ever seen. "I don't know if this is a weapon," he began around a mouthful of his own nerves. But the children bound the thing that became him with more than glass. They bound him to a place and to a season, to the water and to the wood. The way he was made matters. The way anything is made matters when you want to unmake it. "Dragonglass," Grey Worm said, because he had watched his men stab until their arms failed. "Yes, and the trees, and blood."
Some swallowed.
It's not just a story that the Isle of Faces held the pact when men and children agreed not to drown each other forever. A thing that is bound must be unbound at the knot. He licked dry lips. If a blade of dragonglass is pushed through a heart under a living weirwood, with king's blood and with a choice, the last word lay on the table like an actual weight. Choice is heavier than iron when the choice is terrible enough. "Whose blood?" Sansa asked. The steadiness in her voice was a feat only someone who had learned such steadiness could perform. She did not look at Jon. She did not look at Daenerys. Sam's gaze faltered toward them anyway. "We do not know whose is needed. It may be lineage. It may be oath. It may be the one who means the most to him." Arya's fingers tightened on the dagger she had carried out of Winterfell and into Dragonstone and out of sleep again and again. The edge had pushed its way under the skin of her palm in a neat silver kiss. "He did not look at me as a person," she said, tone flat. "He looked at me as weather looks at grass." "Then we do not gift him our meaning," Tyrion said. He met Jon's eyes. "We make our own." Jon did not answer immediately. He traced a river's course on the table with a scarred finger. He had always been a man who paused before an answer, who weighed himself before he spoke. "We will not win a war against him in the open. Soldiers are meat for his larder. We harry. We starve what can be starved. We burn and run and burn again. And we find this knot." He looked to Sam. "At the Isle." Sam nodded. "The weirwoods there are old in a way that makes the others seem children. Steward Othmar of the Citadel said the tree rings keep the sound of the first oaths if a man knows how to listen." "Othmar's been mad since Egg was a boy," Davos grunted. "Perhaps," Sam said. "But madness kept lighting a candle that was supposed to have been cold for 1,000 years. They built a plan out of sparser stuff than plans usually enjoy. They sent ravens and got no answers, and sent more and sent men as well. They knew what the Night King would do next, because there was only one thing to do if one wished to end a song: break its throat." Cersei sat on a chair hammered out of other people's swords and drank wine that had gone faintly to vinegar, and told herself stories about storms she had already survived. She lit a wildfire smile when Qyburn brought her a map of the city stitched with secret caches. The Golden Company drilled outside her window, gold in the half-light, and Euron Greyjoy's fleet bobbed obscene as fried fish in the green water beyond. She could smell winter in the hallways and did not know she was smelling herself as well, because fear is a perfume with notes of one's own making. Jaime left and came back. He went as far as the Rose Road before he felt the ache that had always lived in his chest tighten on its chain and pull. The ache wore a name with it. Brienne waited at the crossroads with snow on her lashes and no demand in her eyes. They said nothing a long while. He gave her a sword salute with a blade that was not Valyrian and did not glow, and turned his horse. He could not stop himself. He had spent too long learning how to be a different man. He had not yet learned how to stop being the old one. When at last the undead tide reached the city, it came across fields the color of old bone. The Blackwater did not freeze at first. It shivered and lay low and dark. Men on the walls watched the dead reach the water and go in. They went down like stones thrown into a well. They did not come up. 20,000 went in before the surface went still. The next 10,000 walked out upon a skin of glass that had not been there the moment before. That was when bells rang. Cersei stood between her red keep windows and the heatless world. She raised her cup and realized it was too heavy. She set it aside. Qyburn moved his lips and produced words that darted about the chamber like bats and rested nowhere. The mountain stood without breath. Far below, the Golden Company wheeled to form, to points, to lines. Harry Strickland's jaw worked as if there were meat in it and no teeth. The first rank leveled spears that shone with pitch and promise. The dead did not change pace. Those with bows lit their arrows on torches dipped in green. The green raced up the shafts with eagerness. A captain shouted the name of a girl he had known when he was young and did not remember he had done so. Dragonfire would have made an answer then. Dragonfire did answer, but not the queen's. Viserion took the sky with a noise like ice breaking on a tide. His breath cut the air blue. The first gate of kings landing buckled and sagged as if heat had bent it. The second cracked the way someone might crack their knuckles. The third fell in a spray, and the street beyond filled with the first and oldest shape the city had known: panic. Wildfire woke in Undercrofts and in the mouths of the tunnels the Targaryens had once used to make themselves everywhere at once. It woke behind doors and between stones and once in a baker's oven. Green flowers erupted into petals that were people and wood and horse. The dead plowed through the heat and the living died in it, and both turned the air to a choking, singing thing. The Night King walked where the fire licked his boots, and it parted around him the way water parts around a rock. He did not look up when Drogon came on a scream out of cloud and poured red across the blue. Red upon blue upon green. Daenerys saw him stand, and she saw him raise his hand. He had a spear then, a thing made of winter sharpened to a single intention. She felt Drogon's body tense under her like a bow pulling to dangerous draw. She banked hard, and the spear took a tower instead, and stones went up like a flock of birds. She did not try for him again with flame. A corner of her mind, small but very hard, understood that she had learned something, and what she had learned would cost her. She dove to rake the streets with heat anyway because heat was something that still obeyed her and the living needed that. She cut a swath and widened it, a passage for those who still had legs and luck. She saw Tyrion there, a small figure shepherding a knot of people, and for a blink she wanted very much to pluck him up and set him down somewhere that smelt of clean water and sugar. She did not. She could not. There were too many men with faces she would never know. Jaime reached his sister in a palace that sang very quietly with the strain of its own stones. He did not bring promises. He did not think he had any left. "Leave," he said, surprised to find the word soft. "Come away. There is a ship. There is always a ship in your stories," Cersei said. She put her hand on his cheek, and it was cold, and his was warm, and both of them resented the other for it. "I am the state. He wants the state. I do not go to him. He comes to me." They went together to the throne room because it was a room that had told their family who they were. Qyburn hunched along behind, a carrion bird who had once been a man. The mountain's armor scratched stone and set the teeth on edge. They stood before the Iron Throne and heard the city dying in long breaths of different colors. When the doors opened, they did not open because a guard had opened them. They opened the way a mouth opens. The Night King brought the cold with him the way a king brings his guards. The temperature fell into the body rather than around it. Frost took the stone. Frost wrote itself in hair, in cloth, in eyelashes. He left footprints of rime. He did not draw a blade because he had never needed to. He stood where Aegon had stood when he'd imagined a chair and realized the chair he had imagined would always be smaller than the idea it represented. Jaime moved because he could not do otherwise. It was a flaw he had fought and a grace he had bled for. Widow's Wail had come back to the Lannisters by a circuitous route and now gleamed like a promise he had no right to make. He aimed for the heart. The blade never met meat. The air in front of it hardened like glass, and a sound like a bell ringing underwater chimed through the chamber. Ice climbed the steel, and the steel fought and screamed and then fell apart in his hands like bread. He looked down at the pieces because he could not understand a world in which steel did that. The Night King touched him with a knuckle. Jaime went to his knee, a knight before a king. He did not choose the posture, and that humiliation would have eaten him if he were not so very busy dying. Cersei made a noise that sounded like a name and like an animal's warning both. Qyburn stepped forward with a device of his own, some filigreed thing of glass and tiny copper bows that whirred like bees. It did nothing to the winter. The winter did something to it. The mountain, slow and certain, lifted his sword. The Night King did not turn his head to look. The mountain stepped to the side and stood. Cersei had gone very still. Her eyes were enormous. She clutched at the air above the arm of the throne the way you might clutch at a robe as it slid from your shoulders. She thought, stupidly, of her younger self running through sunlit corridors, of lemon cakes, of the smell of a horse she had loved. She thought of her children. She thought of her father's hands. She thought of calling for her little brother and did not. She drew breath because that was what bodies do until they are told to stop. The blue gaze told her. She stopped. When he sat, the room changed. The temperature fell another hand's width and stayed. The frost grew ferns along the iron barbs. The throne took the shape of him, and for an instant it looked like the chair had been meant to hold winter all along. The world's most elaborate chair pulled in its knives and bent them to a crown he did not wear, because he did not need to announce what he already embodied. He did not smile. He did not do anything a human face does to indicate the presence of a human soul. He simply made his choice into a location and occupied it. Far below, in corridors that stank of refugees' breath and fear, Sandor Clegane stopped, as if a hand had pushed itself against the middle of his chest. The torches along the wall guttered all together and then steadied, pathetic little candles attempting to light a feast hall. He looked at the girl beside him, and in his mind she was not a lady and not the child he had called little bird, but a person he had walked too far with to call by any old name. Sansa did not look back at him. She had left something of herself upstairs when she had stood on the outer rampart and watched a dragon be speared and had not screamed. He admired that in a way he would never tell anyone. "South," he said. "We go south." They did. So did half the city, those who could move. Many went to the river because people always do, as if water remembers their names. The Blackwater supported them a time and then cracked and set its own teeth in their ankles and shins. Davos came up the channel between ice-narrowed piers with 3 black crows' wings of sail and a cargo of fear he had not meant to carry again. He took aboard as many as he could and pushed those he could not with his eyes onto the quays where someone who was not him might take responsibility. Arya moved through the city the way a bone moves through a dog that has learned patience. She made holes in the dead with the dagger, holes that did not heal, and dragged children and old women through doorways and past teeth and through sheets of steam when a wildfire cache lit a cellar from the inside out. She had a way of appearing where it would be most useful for her to appear. She took a baker's boy from under the hooves of a white that still wore a guard's helm and a woman with a braided crown whose maid had abandoned her and a cat with one eye from beneath the corpse of a fishmonger who was never going to sell that last trout. She did the things that occupied hands. It turned out that kept her from thinking of the tree and the boy asleep under it. On Dragonstone they spread maps and then put them away because the map changed faster than the ink could dry. The dead held King's Landing. The dead held the Rose Road and the King's Road and the hills around Rosby. The dead did not yet hold Storm's End or Dragonstone or the Vale, whose high passes remembered winter and had reasons to resent it. Dorne warmed itself and held itself close and sent no word and no army. The Martells had survived by waiting before. Yara Greyjoy ran the iron line between islands that knew how to wring life from a stone, and the long, low coastline of the Dornish marches that did not look so vulnerable, with salt and spray, and the way sea was always on her side. She harried where she could and burned what must not be allowed to feed the white. Jon and Daenerys took what sky remained to them and harried too. Drogon was scarred now, ribs like curved masts, one wing notched where ice had taken a bite. He flew with a ferocity that made his shadows look like torn banners across the cloud. At night Jon sat by the brazier on Dragonstone's wind-struck battlements and cupped his hands around the heat and looked down at the dark where the waves worked on the rocks. Ghost lay with his head across Jon's boots and woofed, and Jon scratched his ear without looking, the way a hand finds a talisman. "Sam says the Isle of Faces," he said when he could make his voice behave. "I say we will never get there across the water if it keeps freezing. And if we wait, well..." He watched the sea bite itself and spit salt at the sky. "It's a stitch in a wound that's bleeding out." "It will not be enough," Daenerys said, and there was no bitterness in it. She was a woman who had learned to name the things that went against her and then to look for the thing that would go with her anyway. "But it will be what we have. We have always been a people who take our bad odds seriously." He looked at her as if that had been something new he needed to hear, though he had always known it. "If there is king's blood," he began, cautious as a man lifting a hot pot from a stove. "Mine is a thing the world hasn't decided what to do with," she finished. She had never been gentle, and she did not begin to be now. "If it must be one of us, Jon Snow, then we will not assume it must be you." Her mouth tightened. "I have bled for thrones. I can do it for more than myself." He shook his head. "This is not the way of burning cities for a chair," he said, and did not mean it to sound as it might have. Her eyes flicked and then steadied. "It has never been about a chair," she said, and for a breath he believed her completely, and the world's terrible sense of humor seemed to take a holiday. "It has been about a name, but names can be set aside. People can be kept." She stood, skirts clacking ice where the sea had salted them. "If I must bleed, I will bleed where it does something." They left Dragonstone with 2 ships and a skiff and courage braided out of old grudges. Davos steered because it was the profession he returned to when the world needed something done right. The wind cooperated in the way winter winds do. Grudgingly, as if to say it was not doing it for them, but only because it had decided, for its own reasons, to blow that way. The Isle of Faces rose out of the lake on the second evening like something that had decided not to be a rumor anymore. The water around it did not take a skin of ice, though the air tried and tried. The trees were indeed older than other trees, and they had faces that had learned some restraint over the centuries. Davos set them ashore and backed the boat off like a man leaving a friend who prefers to pray alone. "I'll watch the water," he said. "I'm good with water." They climbed under boughs that smelled of old prayer and last summer.
�𝒏𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒚.
His breath made ghosts. The weirwood's leaves brushed their shoulders, and they came to a clearing where the ground held an echo that did not belong to footsteps but to something that had pressed it once and been very heavy and refused to leave entirely. It was not a comfortable place. Sam set down his satchel with reverence and clumsiness both. "There," he said, pointing to a root that broke the earth like a white forearm. "The bindings." His voice thinned. "I don't know if I will know." "Enough," John said. He drew Longclaw and laid it on the ground before the root. He looked at the edge and saw it had taken chips. He remembered when he had first held it and felt something pass into him that he had not been sure he wanted. It had been a weight he had thought he could carry because it was his. That was the trick. It had never been entirely his. Arya crouched opposite with the dagger across her knees. She had cleaned it until the steel had no blemish at all, and then she had stopped because a piece of steel should carry what it has done. She met John's eyes and did not look away. She had been a girl once who had been wronged. She was not that girl anymore, and though she mourned her girl self, she did not want her back. Daenerys came into the clearing with a lamp, though the lamplight did not travel far in the green. Grey Worm came behind her with his spear and his watchfulness that had only grown more intense and deadly. Missandei with a bowl of water that had herbs steeping in it. Tyrion was there as well because he had been in nearly every important room for so long that it would have been unnatural for him not to be. He stood near Sam because knowledge and failure make strange companions. "Choice," Sam said. "It has to be a choice." Daenerys set the lamp down and the flame hunched in the draft that came from nowhere. "Whose?" A sound lifted out of the trees like a breath being taken by something that had never had lungs. John flinched and then stilled. "He is coming," he said, and did not know how he knew it. He looked to where the water showed itself between trunks, and the surface went briefly to glass, not frozen, only so perfectly still that it reflected their faces without lying. "We do not have time to debate blood." He drew the skinning knife from his belt. "I am of the line of Aegon," he said, and then laughed, raw and soft at once. "Or so a world that doesn't matter insists. If it is blood that opens, let it open." "Don't you dare think you get to decide," Arya said, anger a bright coin in her voice. He looked at her. "Since when have you allowed anyone to decide things for you?" "Since now," she said, and took the knife from his hand with motion so quick and so practiced that he did not argue. She turned her left palm upward without ceremony and cut a neat line across it. Her face did not flinch. Blood brimmed. She reached out and let it drip on the root. The ground did not shudder. The trees did not whisper in words. The blood soaked in the way liquids have always soaked into ground. "There," she said, almost bored, because ceremony was a way to hold fear down. Daenerys set her own palm to the edge and cut. She had done this before in other rooms for other reasons. Her blood was darker. It fell and streaked the root in a way that seemed to please nothing but gravity. John followed, jaw set. The root took him as it had taken them. Grey Worm, face impassive, drew his thumb over the point of his spear until a bright bubble welled and offered that as well. Even Tyrion, after a moment's considering with eyebrows knit, held out his hand and let a drop go. "There," he said dryly, "I have owed stranger altars stranger offerings."
�𝒏𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒚.
He put the dragonglass blade he had brought across the bleeding. "It has to." He trailed off because he did not know the verb he wanted. He took a breath and let it go. "He's here," he whispered, though the words did not have to carry. The cold entered the clearing like law. Frost found the lamp and pinched the flame to a very tiny flower and then to nothing. Footsteps made no sound. The Night King came between trees that had been growing since before his making, and did not look up at them because he did not have to. He did not look at Jon or at Daenerys or at the man with the little wit he had always used as a blade. He looked at the root and the dark streak on it and the small black knife laid crosswise like a child's game. Arya moved because she was a blade that had taken vows to the god of getting it done. The dagger came up from her knee in a wordless line. She did not leap this time. She did not need to. She walked as if she were crossing a small stream on flat stones, and at the last stone she flowed sideways. The Night King's hand rose. Her wrist did not go where it had gone before. It disobeyed its own fear. Her knee struck earth. The dagger's point kissed a place beneath the rib and above the belt. The world hung a heartbeat, and the heartbeat was a century. He caught the blade with 2 fingers. For a moment, human desperation made foolhardy petitions to physics, to gods, to luck. The steel did not move. The blue eyes turned to Arya's face, and she saw herself again there, smaller and further away. He could break her. He did not. He pushed the blade back, and the dragon glass at its hilt chimed against the root. Jon came in low, Longclaw carving a crescent that would have taken a man's knees. It met that same impossible air and sparked blue. The jolt wrenched the sword from his hands. It hung an instant before falling and buried its Valyrian edge in loam that had never known such metal. Daenerys stepped forward with empty hands and a mouth that said words in a language that had not known snow. "Dracarys," she said anyway, and the red glow that had been hovering beyond the trees came in the shape of an animal that had persisted when the rest of the world had refused to. Drogon's fire met the clearing and ran around its edges as if a bowl had been placed that it could not quite fill. The trunks glowed, sap screaming, and yet the leaves did not catch. The Night King stood in color and did not take any into himself. He put his hand to the root. Sam made a sound the way a man makes a sound when he watches a page he has spent a life writing go into a fire. Ice crawled along the wood. It touched the streaks of their blood and paused. That pause was smaller than a full blink, and in it the wind outside the clearing changed direction as if considering an alternative life. Then the ice went on. The root whitened and whitened until it was the color of an old man's hair, and then the color of a funeral cloth. He turned his head toward Arya again, and this time he took the dagger from her. It slid from her fingers because her fingers had given up on warmth and were no longer sure of their own edges. He did not keep the knife. He dropped it. It struck the frozen root, and something in the weirwood's remnant sap and in the blade's old sins did not tolerate the combination. The steel rang and cracked down a third of its length. Arya felt the fissure like a fault line open under her own ribs. "Enough," Jon said then, and it was not a command and not a plea. It was a declaration a man makes to a storm when he is finished being impressed by it. He put his palm on the dragonglass blade that lay across the root and pushed. The edge went into his hand like a teacher, came out red. He clamped his fingers around it and did not let go, though it burned colder than ice and hotter than brand. He shoved. The blade walked into his palm and then out and then through muscle that had known other cuts. It struck the root and sank the smallest fraction of an inch. He did not stop. He pushed with both hands now and with a part of himself that had never been a body. Daenerys' hand came onto his and her blood ran down his wrist because she opened her wound again deliberately. And what flowed between their fingers and the blade and the tree was a language the world had been trying to teach them for a long time. The dragonglass shivered, not with cold, but with a tone that found bone and taught it to hum. And in that hum a memory lifted out of the place like breath in winter. It was not a picture. It was a pressure. It was the shape of a promise made a very long time ago, and the Night King's head tilted 1 degree, a tick that acknowledged a new piece in a board he had not thought to look at again. Then he closed his fingers over the blade and the hum broke off like a choked song. The glass went to powder in his hand and blew toward the lake the way ashes blow when an old man finally sleeps in truth. They did not die in that clearing. He did not trouble to kill them. He had been distracted a moment and had decided that did not amuse him enough to warrant changing his plan. He turned and went away the way winter goes away, with the impression that it has not, in fact, left. Storm's end held. The sea threw itself at the walls in a tantrum, and the dead thought without ingenuity about how to be water and failed. The fortress had been built on a very old, very stubborn idea that some things should not fall. It filled to its rafters with the last free men and women of the Stormlands and the Reach, and some from further afield who liked the sound of stone that denied both fire and frost. Gendry found himself on its parapet with a hammer in his hand because that was where he had always belonged, really, and you could sometimes come home by going forward without meaning to. In the Vale, the Ares passes iced but held, and the knights became a people who trained in white breath instead of dust. Sansa wore furs that made her hair look like a flame. She sent out riders with messages and took in families with names she would learn in the next months by the pace of their grief. Robin Arryn learned to sit a bench without his mother, and to drink something bitter without gagging, and to sign his name like a lord. Jon Royce taught boys to stand and old men to speak in turn. They sharpened what arrows they had left and fletched new ones with goose quills and stubbornness, and listened to stories about the way summers used to be told by someone's grandmother who still smelled of rosemary and bread. Old Town did fall eventually. The Hightower's lamp went out in a hiss when salt froze in the wick. The maesters burned their papers because paper hungers for flame. In their last hours, they learned that the Iron Link for Ravenry and the Black Link for the Higher Mysteries were both made for winter. Sam had taken the books that mattered, and the boy who would be a man someday and the girl who would make him one, and left. He sat in a tower room on Dragonstone and read by a flame that left his skin feeling scoured, and thought. The trick with a war you cannot win is to survive it longer than the thing that thinks it can. Then he forced himself to sleep and dreamed of a tree that had been white and now was a bone. And he woke with a single sentence he could not keep from speaking aloud. He is bound to moments, not just places. He wrote it down with a slow hand. Days grew long and identical, like a series of coins minted with the same dour face. The sky over King's Landing remained white, a lid that would not lift. The bay crusted and then turned solid, a slab where ships lay entombed in the precise poses in which they had stopped. The red keep turned into an absence of heat, a dark geometry laced with lacework frost. Inside the throne room, their breath hung on the air like banners of surrender. There were no courtiers. There were no counselors. There was a king, and there was a chair, and around them the memories of 10,000 petitions that had not mattered. Qyburn went once more before that throne with a crate in which a thing moved without moving. He had removed parts from other things to create this, and the pride he felt had warmed him in his cell on nights when the river sang in a key that made his teeth itch. He set it down and opened it. The thing inside was pale and blinked again. It had not needed to blink, but it did. He said words about obedience and continuance and the civilization of death. The Night King lowered his gaze. Qyburn became a sculpture of crystal, and then was a scatter of pieces sufficiently interesting to crunch underfoot. Sandor Clegane came to the city with a winter moon and an old grudge that had rusted but not broken. He came with Arya and with a plan that acknowledged the possibility of plans failing. They moved through the sewer that had once been the road for a smuggler's gifts, and Davos' memory proved a map that still led. The passages had changed in places where stone had sighed and given up, or where the cold had weathered mortar into powder. Arya went first because she could fit where he could not. He followed where he could, breaking edges down so she might be less torn when she came back. He did this with the patience of a man who has learned that fury is not a ladder but a well. They came up into a corridor where frost had drawn ferns on the walls, delicate fronds sketched as if a careful child had been allowed to decorate. Arya stood in them a moment, looking smaller than she had in the forest because everything here was measured against a larger scale of human ambition. He crossed himself against a faith he did not own and did not laugh when the old habit soothed him a fraction. He smelled something behind the frost, a sour, old blood stink. He knew it. He had lived with it all his life. The mountain stood in an archway like a piece of wall they had forgotten to build over. His helm was off. The ruin of his face revealed itself without any attempt to rearrange itself into a mask. Arya shifted and Sandor put a hand out. "This one is mine," he said very quietly. "You told me once to leave you to it," Arya replied, no louder. "I learned from masters when to refuse a command. Then this is not a command." He looked at the ruin and the ruin looked at him. The corridor shrank until it was only the space between them and the way their feet held the stone. "This is an ask." She looked at him and she saw the boy behind the man and saw the man he might have been. She slid into shadow because shadows were where she grew best and found a different path up and away. Sandor stepped into the light. The fight was ugly and long and not a dance. It was resentment given bone. It was the argument of a house against its own foundations. They broke pieces off each other the way the sea breaks masonry when it has been allowed to gnaw at it long enough. 𝒔𝒉𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒚 would have been something that crowds could have cheered once. There was no crowd. There was the sound of two men making a case to a god that could not be bothered to attend. In the end, it was fire that decided it. The brazier had guttered but not gone, and a trickle of oil ran under it like a vein. Sandor put his brother's head there and watched it make a steam that smelled of pork and something that should never be a kitchen smell. He did it without joy, and when it was finished he leaned against the wall and laughed until he coughed and coughed until he bled. Then he went up, because up was where his feet wished to take him even when his sense begged them to go elsewhere. Arya found the side of the throne room behind a false door that had not been closed quite flush because winter had swelled the wood. She put her eye to a crack and saw the chair that had been the world's long mistake. The shape seated in it might almost have been a statue if not for the way the cold condensed on his cheekbones and melted and condensed again in never-falling tears. Men once came to that room to ask for justice and for bread and for permission to buy each other. Now the petitions were all one petition, and their answer was that an absence sat on a presence and made it clear that the two belonged. She had her dagger. If it had been whole, would it have been different? She breathed as she had been taught, slow in, slower out, until the pace of it was a metronome no tremor could jostle. She rose, she stepped into that great space, and the sound of her boots' sole on ice made a pretty note that went nowhere. His head turned. He watched her come. She had dreamed of sprint and leap and shock. She walked. The air grew so cold around her that her throat wanted to seize and her eyes to water and freeze. She blinked and did not feel the tears. She came until she could have touched the iron of the arm of the chair. She could see, in the polished shards, the broken remains of many men's ambitions, her face cut into bright knives. "Get up," she said, and her voice made a smoke that drifted and did not reach him. "If you are to be a king, come down and be killed like one." He did not. Her hand tightened. The dagger had a fracture that ran a third of the way, and that third felt like a future. She lifted it and set the tip against the place she guessed a human neck would prefer not to be touched and pushed. The resistance was not there. The blade slid down as if along a wall of glass. It had been well made. It went to its break, and then the break finished the rest for it. The halves fell like pieces of black snow. She took a step back and marveled that her disappointment was not larger. He looked at her the way winter looks at any living thing, with a patience that assumes it will get its way without anger. He raised his hand almost idly. Her feet froze to the floor and the skin of her ankles stuck to the boots, and she lifted one foot anyway and left her heel there like a snake leaves a skin. She kept moving. Felt right. That she would continue felt right even if she did not go faster. He did not even amuse himself by killing her. He let her live and left her with the knowledge that her refusal had been noticed and found harmless. She turned and went down the hall because that was the direction that had not killed her yet. On the stairs, she found Sandor leaning his shoulder against a wall. He was bleeding in a number of places you could not choose to ignore. She took his arm and he took her weight, and they went on without turning their heads. Time bent. The winter that had taken the throne discovered what all rulers discover: that ruling is a matter of attention and appetite. The Night King's attention did not move as a man's does. He did not concern himself with ships or tariffs, with grain or law. He attended to temperature and to the slow conquest of breath. In Dorne, children splashed in a river under a frost that came overnight and broke by noon, and their mothers watched the line where shade fell and pulled them back when toes went white. In the Reach, farmers' fields crisped and rattled and then lay under a glass that would not melt. In the Riverlands, the water stiffened into plains and a fox ran across it, surprised at his own daring. The Vale grew a beauty terrible and precise. Storm's End roared at the sea and the sea roared back. At Dragonstone, Sam's ink ran slow in the cold and fast when the fire roared. He wrote and crossed out and wrote again. "Moments," he said to Gilly, who warmed her hands over the coals and smiled at the child and at him in alternating measures. "He is tethered to moments. He returns to them. He sits in them. He lets them sit in him. The chair is one." He bit his lip. The tree was another. The wall. He looked up, eyes wide. Not just places, problems, the making of him, the taking of power. He fumbled through pages. "He will leave the chair for one moment only, and it will be for another like it. You talk like a maester and a madman both," Gilly said fondly, because she had learned the taste of his knowing and of his guessing and could tell them apart. He went to Tyrion, who was becoming a man who discussed impossible things as if they were soup recipes and thus more likely to be edible. "He is a king the way a flood is a king," Tyrion said. "So we damn him with stones and with small, stubborn men. And with a moment," Sam said, "we force him to choose." He wet his lips. "We make another throne. You propose to build a chair and dare him to sit?" Tyrion's eyebrows climbed. "I have known stranger seductions." "No," Sam said, words tumbling now. "A crowning, a choosing. We draw him to a place he must regard as the marrow of the story. We force a question in front of him." He looked to the sea and shivered. "We burn the Iron Throne." Tyrion closed his eyes briefly. "You are going to make of me a man who argues for arson as a policy." "It is only iron," Sam said. "Iron and ideas. And the iron has outlived its idea." Jon stood at the window while they argued and watched the water slap the rocks as if trying to wake them. He thought of oaths. He had been made by oaths as much as by blood. He had learned that oaths were sometimes ropes, sometimes handholds. He put his palms on the stone. It was not warm. He said nothing until the others had used their words, and then he said simply, "We will need the dragon." Daenerys did not answer for a moment. She had been counting. She counted every day, and each count was a bead on a rosary of loss. "You have him," she said. "You have me." They would not get close as ships. The bay could change its mind and seize their hulls while they sat. They went by air while the air still moved. Drogon took them because he knew where they weighed in him and because he was of a species that remembers its oaths to fire. They came in under cloud, and the white above the city rolled on its back like an animal presenting a belly for a stroke it did not plan to enjoy. The Iron Throne had lived many lives. It had sung under the hammer and under the men who leveled their palms against it as they swore and lied. It had pricked and scarred. It had been the background for victories and for the very quiet places between promises and their breakings. It had been cleaned with blood and with wine. It was not ready to not be. Drogon's fire made a new song. It fell on the chair like hot rain on a parched road, and the steam lifted curious and then angry. The iron went red and then orange and then paled as it cried into a shape that was not a chair. It slumped. It flowed into a puddle of metal that hissed and pouted and finally lay cooling like a silver lake. The swords within it, the ones that had always liked to show off their shapes, melted their pride. The scream of it went through the city and into the sky and through the bones of the dead and the living and told them, "This symbol ends." The Night King stood. He stood because his attention had been moved by a piece on the board he had not expected to be nudged again. He walked down from his platform of winter and into the square of stone where the chair had been and looked at the pool cooling there. He knelt the way men do at graves. He put his hand into the metal. Took nothing from him, he took nothing from it. It cooled around his palm and made a gauntlet of dull steel that remembered having been 10,000 promises. He lifted it, and for the first time since the wall of the world had fallen, an expression moved his mouth. It was not anger. It was the complexity of an animal recognizing an old adversary by smell. He looked up when Jon came forward across stone that burned his boots. The soles charred and stuck, and he left pieces of leather behind him like a man leaving his fingerprints in some place that would one day matter. He left Longclaw where it was because it had not been useful in the forest. He held nothing but his hands and the weight of a choice he had been walking toward since the day a man he called father had said, "You are a Stark, though you have my name." "Here," Jon said, and opened his arms without moving them. "Here is a moment. Choose. You cannot truly lure winter. You can only be in its path. But there are eddies." And a boy who had died and not died and had held a protective cloak over those he loved all his life found the one that the god of cold took for curiosity if not for interest. The Night King stepped down from the dais and walked toward him through air that crackled. He had killed kings who had begged and kings who had lied and kings who had called him myth until he was the only reality left in their mouths. He had not killed one who did not carry a weapon and did not kneel. He came close enough that Jon could have reached out and what? Embrace? Strike? He did neither. Daenerys stood to the side, and every muscle in her body was a drawn bow. Drogon's throat glowed and shuddered as he held back flame and did not understand why his mother had asked this of him. Tyrion stood behind a pillar where he had once hidden from a sister, and he had a small knife in his hand and no plan to use it and a plan to use it both. Arya waited at the mouth of a corridor where Frost had sketched wildflowers. Sandor leaned bleeding against a buttress and thought of chickens. Sam had a page in his hand that had gotten wet and had dried and was buckled, and he realized he had memorized it and could let it go. Grey Worm measured distances he could cross in a last run. Missandei watched the way the air moved across the blue. The Night King raised his gauntlet hand. Jon did not flinch. He put the cold palm against Jon's chest, just left of the sternum where a boy's heart might have been trained to sit still. The cold knifed and then sank. Jon thought very quickly of the hot caverns under the wall, of Ghost's fur, of the stink of the stable and the way the grooms swore in winter, of a girl with strawberries in her lap on a day that had been all sunlight. He thought of snow falling sideways. He thought of the first time he had roared a song on the wall and been laughed at. He thought, for a second, of a man with pale eyes and the way that man had smiled before cutting across Jon's life in red. "I choose," Jon said, though no one had asked him to, and then he did something he had learned from men who had kept him alive by little tricks all his life. He closed his arms. The embrace was not warm. It was the opposite. It was the kind of hug in which one person offers the other a shape and says, "Inhabit this or we both fall." Jon took the cold against his ribs and his jaw, and the old scar across his belly warned him he was being a fool, and he did not stop. He had forgotten how to stop. He had been trained to keep going where it was worst. He could not tell you later if the Night King had arms to put around him or if the cold simply moved around him in a shape that made sense to dyers and to mothers wrapping babies in swaddling. But that old piece of dragonglass language they had written in the wood moved under his skin now, and blood spoke in a grammar older than words. The knot tugged like a fish on a line. It tugged the way a memory tugs tears out of a hard man when he smells a certain soap. It tugged, and the blue eyes widened not with fear but with comprehension. The wind in the square rose. The frost wrote itself faster and then slower. The skins of ice within the puddled metal cracked in veins that radiated from the place where the Night King's hand lay on Jon's chest. The pool sighed as it cooled and contracted. Something gave then. It was not a sound you can name. It was more like the memory of a song forgetting a verse. And then winter remembered itself. The cold rushed back into the body, into the city, into the sky. It took its shape again on the throne where there was no longer a throne, and on the hill where there was no longer a seat, and in the hall where there were no longer courtiers. The blue gaze lifted from the man who had dared and rested on all of them. In turn, it rested a fraction longer on the woman with silver hair who had burned his symbol, and on the girl with the broken knife, and on the little man with the little blade he had no intention of drawing. It passed over the old smuggler and the soldier without a dick and the woman whose voice had made men better. Passed on. He stepped back, and Jon caught himself before he fell because he would not give the bastard that political theater. He straightened. He took a breath, tore his throat like a sharp bread crust. It had not worked. It had almost worked. The difference between those two things is the whole hinge of history and also a hair's breadth. Winter returned to its chairless stage and sat. The city settled around it the way a dog settles around a hearth, whether or not there is a fire. The dead moved again in their slow tides. They watched the sky for the direction of the cold. They served the way ships once watched the vein. Davos took them out by water. The ice groaned and parted grudgingly, and the boat went through in splinters and swears. He did not speak until the wind had learned to move again. Then he said, "We have done what we came to do." "What we came to do was kill him," Arya said, and her voice did not shake. It would if she had any respect left for shaking. Tyrion rubbed a finger next to his eye as if erasing grit that had decided to become a grief. "Sometimes," he said, "surviving a god is the political equivalent of slitting his throat." Daenerys looked back at the city. It had always been a problem, had King's Landing. It had always demanded more than it deserved. It had always insisted on being the beginning and the end of stories that were not in fact about it. "He sits," she said quietly. "He sits," Jon echoed, and the words held contempt and a hunger he could not ever deny. He had never wanted a throne. Want and need rarely admit their cousins. The months that followed learned new shapes. Winter did not spread quite as fast as fear had suggested it would. It was as if, having taken the heart, it could afford to be more careful with the limbs. It thickened in a belt across the middle of the world and held steady there, breathing out and in as if in sleep. Dorne became a refuge, hot in its belly and obstinate at its edges. The Dornish learned to share their dates and their water and their rebukes. The Ironborn kept to the sea lanes that still flowed and ran dispatches and fishermen, and the occasional noble with less pomp in their sails than they had once planned for. The Vale taught its boys to hunt goats across ice like knights hunting boar and found this worked just as well. Storm's End sent food where it could. Brienne walked its walls with a face that had become for many a comfort because it had become a habit. Sam wrote. He wrote letters and plans and drafts of treaties that would seem merely quaint when the world found itself needing them. He wrote a story about a boy who had grown up in a place far north and had learned to kill things and had learned the value of not killing as well, and then he put his quill down and did not sign it because it was not time yet to set names to pages. He loved Gilly the way a man loves the bowl that fits his hand exactly and knows by its weight when to be filled and when to be emptied. He taught the child letters because that was what fathers do when winter is not going anywhere for a while. Sansa held counsel. She had never meant to be a queen. She had become one in the way women often become what they had not planned to be, by the double alchemy of necessity and talent. She made laws about bread. She made laws about the ownership of wood in winter. She made laws about men who thought the old cruelties a good way to pass time when frost made the nights longer. She worked until her voice went hoarse, and then she drank honey and worked again. She did it without the glamour of coups or banners and found that this suited her. She permitted no one to martyr themselves if she could help it. She sent for Arya, and when her sister came she took her hands and warmed them between her own and said nothing for a very long time because sometimes the silence between words is the only prayer you can trust. Jon rode the line of the cold, breathing steam and counting. He went out with small bands and came back with fewer and did not send men where men would not return unless absolutely forced to be cruel. He became, without meaning to and without endorsing the role, a figure in stories. Children drew him with a wolf at his side on the slate walls of halls where Clegane had spilled soup, and it comforted them. He hated that it comforted them. He rode to the sea and saw a whale die under a crust of ice, its eye the size of a man's grief. He rode inland and found a village that had taught itself to sleep in shifts because breath gives heat to a room and they could not spare the heat if all slept at once. He laughed once in a month when Tormund Giantsbane came back south with 70 men and a satchel of jokes and hugged him so hard his ribs creaked. Tormund told him a story about a woman in a cave and a fire that would not go out, and Jon believed only half of it and cherished the unbelief like a coin. When Tormund left, he took a dozen orphans north because he said the dead were less rude north, and Jon didn't try to dissuade him. Daenerys flew. Drogon rested sometimes with his belly on black stone and the sea under his chin like a cat. She sat by him and learned the patterns of wind in this new world and the way the clouds told on the cold. She did not dream of bells. She dreamed of a child with dark hair whose eyes did not quite guess themselves. In the morning she ate dates along the Dragonstone parapet and argued with Tyrion about supply lines. "We cannot live forever in a siege that refuses to admit it is won," he said. "He is not interested in our negotiations." "No," she said, mouth sticky with sugar. So we negotiate with the living. She sighed. There is one living with an army we do not have that I would rather not dine with. 𝒅𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒚 Greyjoy came, and they dined, and they did not like each other much, and they agreed nonetheless because they were women who had learned to stomach company when the alternative was starvation. 𝒅𝒂𝒔 brought salted cod and a map of currents and a joke about kings that pleased no one and was nonetheless kept. Daenerys brought Unsullied, who did not panic in a crowd, and an understanding that to keep Dorne fed they would have to be mean to the Reach for a while. Once, because the world does offer even in winter a flourish, Bran spoke. Arya was at the heart tree on Dragonstone, a smaller, redder thing than its cousins, and she had a question in her mouth she had not admitted to even in her own sleep. The leaves moved not with wind but with intention. A voice came into her ear that had not used air in some time. It was not a whisper, it was quieter than that. It said her name and did not make a demand of it. And for an instant she was small again, and there was a boy with a bow and a smile, and another boy with dark hair and solemn eyes, and another who had always been a little apart, watching the way insects moved in the mud. She shook. She put her forehead against the bark. "Tell me what to do," she said, fury coating the edges of the plea. Bran did not tell her. He simply let her feel for a moment the angle at which the Night King sat in time. Not above, not outside. He sat in one place an impossible ages, and he visited others, and those other moments were crowns. He visited the making. He visited the fallings of walls. He visited the sitting in a chair that had been fashioned to say, "This is where choices live." He visited another moment, newer and therefore dearer, the moment when a man had embraced him and in that embrace made a statement about the nature of kingship. When the leaves stilled again and the bark was just bark, Arya lifted her head. She wiped her face. Her eyes were not dry, but they knew their work. "He can be made to choose," she said later to Sam and to Jon and to the woman in whose hair the light always caught. "He can be made to choose in a place that is not his chair." "Which place?" Jon asked. "Dragonstone," she said. "He has chosen here before, and he will choose here again because we will put something in front of him that does not allow for sitting." They built a throne out of ash. It was a joke and a provocation. It was the size of a chair but not its shape. It was a drift of black in the Dragonstone Great Hall where Targaryens had once danced and once died and once decided to leave and once decided to return. It did not invite sitting. It invited judgment. They placed it on a dais that had held maps and blades and cups and once a queen. Jon stood below and nothing in his hands. Daenerys stood on the other side with a sword that was not a sword, just a length of iron rod heated red at the tip so that it glowed like a coal. She had chosen it because it did not pretend. Arya had her broken dagger across the back of her belt, a promise not to herself but a promise to the wronged. Tyrion had a book. Sam had a page. Davos had a prayer he would not admit to shaping. Grey Worm had 100 men who had learned to stand without flinching at ghosts. They made noise. Noise attracts attention even when attention has become a habit of stillness. They rang a bell. It was not the bell of surrender and it was not the bell of victory. It was a bell that had been rung other times when dragons had landed and a city had decided to continue living. They rang it until the air shook and the dust on the rafters fell in a leathery shower that made Davos swear and brush his hair. Winter came into the hall the way a man comes into a room when he has learned the trick of not making the door. The torches made their little defiance and then accepted what they were offered and died. The cold sat heavy on the tongue. The dead did not come with him. He did not need them. He came alone because sometimes kings like the theater of solitude. He looked at the ash throne. He looked at Jon and at Daenerys and at the people who had chosen to stand and be measured. He looked back at the ash. It was a mockery of everything the chair had ever been. It was also a claim. It said, "The seat is the residue of what the fire had to eat to keep people warm." It said, "The crown is a coal." It said, "We have worn a path around this thing and are tired of it." He stepped onto the dais. "Now," Arya whispered, and he turned his head toward her because he had learned her shape. She walked up the steps from the other side, a small, stubborn figure in furs and leather, and placed the broken dagger on the ash like a coin on a corpse's eye. The ash accepted it and made the steel dirtier. She stepped back and folded her hands and looked, not at him, but at the space just beyond his shoulder where absence makes its own weather. He reached for the ash. There is an art to making a moment into a trap. It has to be credible as a choice. It has to appeal to the part of a person that believes in their own consistency. It has to be bait and it has to be sincere. They had made this with the help of a boy who had sat under trees and listened, and with the help of a woman who had once believed the world would give her what she was owed if she demanded it loudly enough and had learned to ask more persuasive questions, and with the help of a man whose honor had beaten him into a shape that almost fit a crown and who had refused his own myth until it had refused him. They had made a trap that was essentially a true thing. The Night King's fingers sank into the ash, and the ash moved. It moved as if it still remembered being wood. It moved as if it had been asked, for once, to do something other than be a consequence. It moved up his hand and along the iron of the gauntlet that remembered having been 10,000 small promises. It moved the way fungus moves on a log, slow and complete and without malice. It moved and it learned him the way fire learns the shape of a cast iron pan and adjusts. It did not burn him. It did not freeze him. It named him. It named him what he had been made to be. A hinge, a knot, a place where a thing had been done to a man and the man had been taken away. Jon took a breath. He did not know he had been holding it. Now, he said, and he did not know to whom he said it. Daenerys lifted the iron, the red at its tip a single stubborn line of summer. She drove it down through ash and through the iron and into the hand that had been for 1,000 years the hand that ended things. The smell the strike made was a smell no one had ever known. Some part charcoal, some part the cold that comes when a window is opened in a house where the elderly have lain sleeping all winter. The rod left a red memory in the air. The ash hissed. He could have withdrawn. He did not. He was trapped not by the iron, not by the ash, but by the moment. He had been asked to choose and he had chosen, and now he could not unchoose. For the first time, they saw something like strain in the line of his shoulders. He pulled against the shape of the choice and the choice held. Arya moved on air. She was the knife you do not see because you are looking at the king. She hit him from the side where absence does not teach you to be wary. The broken blade, held like an old friend, went for the place just under the jaw where she had always known the seam would be. It glanced again on the skin of impossible air, but only for a fraction. The ash did something to that air. The crack in the blade did something to it as well, a disruption that explained itself to the glass. The steel slipped in as if the world had, for a very brief moment, remembered how to be what it had been when men and women could still surprise it. The blade went into the break. For a heartbeat that was an age, everything in the hall was a sculpture. The arc of Daenerys' arm as she held the iron, the set of Jon's shoulders as he refused to pick up a sword, the line of Sam's jaw as he watched the sentence he had written be read by the only reader it had ever been meant for. Tyrion looked at nothing and saw everything. Davos' lips moved. Grey Worm's spear did not twitch. The small muscle in his jaw did. Missandei's hand closed on the edge of the stone like a woman steadying another in labor. The crack completed itself. The sound was not glass. It was the river in spring taking its ice apart under the hooves of deer. It was grief that has been held too long and finds at last a quiet room. It was a boy's name spoken in a country he had left and had not expected to hear again. The blue in the eyes went to the color of morning, and then to the color of water, and then to the color of stone. The frost on the pillars lifted like the breath of a sleeper, and then sank back and did not lift again. The iron gauntlet, fused from 1,000 swords' pride, fell with a thud that made a little puff of ash. He did not explode into ice. He did not shatter like a story told for too long. He sank to his knees as if in a church. He had not learned to kneel. He kneeled now because the moment was finished, and all kings kneel to that. He looked at Jon and at Daenerys and at Arya and at the ash. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were not human because they had never been, and yet they were less. The blue had gone out of them. There was only the dull color of something that is ready to be stone. He fell forward. He did not break. He lay. Outside, the winter hesitated. The air over the bay thawed by a hair's breadth. In the Vale, A trickle of meltwater ran under a crust, and Robin Aaron laughed because the sound of it made him think of pissing when he'd been a boy and had done so from the moon door because his nurse had not been quick enough. In Dorne, a woman lifted a shawl from her shoulders and did not put it back on. In Storm's End, a boy slid on ice and fell and cried, and the cry had a wet note in it that had been missing for months. In King's Landing, frost receded along a carved lintel and revealed a rose someone had once scratched there. A very bad rose, all triangles. A child with blue eyes that had not belonged to him took one step and then another and dropped to his bottom and screamed. Not a dead thing's scream, but a very human, angry wail. His mother, who had been a dead thing a breath before, took a breath and took him up and had no idea what to do with the new air. She wept because her body had remembered an old habit and because both choices were suddenly possible again, to go on or to stop. In the great hall of Dragonstone, ash drifted down like gray snow, touched hair and shoulders and did not melt because ash doesn't. It settled in a line along the split in the dagger's blade. Arya breathed out and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and found it tasted like burnt bread. "Ha!" she said. Daenerys let the iron drop and it clanged, arraigning the silence. Jon put his palms on his thighs because his hands were shaking and he preferred his legs. Davos scratched his cheek with a blunt nail and swore a prayer that thanked 3 gods at once and insulted all of them just a bit. Sam bent and touched the body out of an instinct he would never be rid of. The flesh was cold but not as impossible as it had been. Tyrion laughed once, not a happy sound and not a cruel one, but the kind that comes when a man breaks the only glass he has been trying not to break and finds there was water in it and the floor will have to be mopped. Grey Worm made the motion that had been drilled into his muscles since a boy. He lowered his spear in salute. Missandei folded her hands and bowed her head and let a tear fall because great events warrant tears just as small kindnesses do. They burned him. They carried the body on a bier made of wood hauled up from a trove the Targaryens had made for their cooking fires. They took it down to the strand where Dragonstone's black sand makes everything look like it is happening at night, even at midday. They set it on the wood and did not make speeches because speeches are for the living and this was for something else. Jon took the torch and looked at Daenerys. She met his gaze and understood that both of them had been made to do this sort of thing too often already. He handed the torch to Arya. She stepped forward and laid flame to tinder without flourish the way she did most things, and the fire went up in a seethe that made the hair on their arms stand. The stink rolled across them. Some stepped back a half step. None left. The ash lifted in little devils, danced, settled. The sea hissed at the promontories. Drogon lay with his chin on the sand and a sound in his chest like a bellows that had not quite made up its mind. When at last the pyre settled to coals, it did not end in a sudden fall. It thinned and thinned until there was nothing left but a place on the beach that would be warmer than the rest for a few hours. They did not cheer. They did not throw cloaks in the air. They stood until the cold made standing a declaration again, and then they went back into the hall where there was soup. Soldiers ate. Queen ate. A man without a dick ate. A girl with a broken knife ate and leaned her shoulder against a pillar and closed her eyes. In King's Landing, thaw came unevenly and without theater. The Blackwater went from plate to slush to chop and belly for a while on a breeze that smelled of salt instead of nothing. People came out of rooms. There were quite a lot fewer of them than there had been. They looked at each other with the shock of having faces. Gardens woke that had not been asked to sleep so long. Seeds had died, but roots had not been consulted and had refused to give up. The city did what cities do. It took stock. It had been ruled by kings and by winter and had learned the lesson endurance teaches. Keep moving. And so it did. In the north, the wind changed timbre. It had been a note sustained, high and unmoving. It dropped a tone. Trees shook out their leaves where they had any left. Winterfell's ruins steamed faintly under a shy sun. Sansa sat and cried one night very quietly where no one would see because there is no shame in choosing one's audience for grief. She cried for a boy on a chair and for a life she had lost and for how complicated relief is. In the morning, she sent more bread to villages within 3 days' ride and refused a marriage that would have been good for the banners and terrible for the bread. There are endings that are really only untyings. There are untyings that leave scars on the rope. The Night King was gone, and what he had done was not. The dead who had been dead returned to their rest, save where fire had denied them the courtesy of bones. Those who had served him unwillingly, with cold in their eyes and a diet of snow, woke in confusion and in a world that would not forgive them but might someday find other words for what had been done with their bodies. The wall at the end of the world was not repaired. It lay in the place where it had fallen like a row of teeth in a skull on a battlefield. No one had the strength to put those teeth back in. They built smaller walls. They taught children where to light fires. John took the road more often than not. He did not return to King's Landing. The city had become someone else's work. He did not return to the south where sand and politics and the smiling knives of courtiers had sharpened themselves for centuries. He went along the seam where white still pressed, because seams are where menders belong. He slept in barns, and he slept beside Ghost with the dog's ribs against his, and he slept in towers that had no roofs. Sometimes he slept in halls, and sometimes he slept in the open and listened to the sky scratch itself along the stars. Daenerys did not take a throne because there was none to take. She became, instead, a woman with lists. She made lists of ships and lists of grain and lists of grievances and lists of men who would not be allowed into certain rooms because they would ruin things. She learned to say to those men what they needed to hear so they would do what was required, and then she would go to the parapet and let the wind take the taste out of her mouth. Once a boy brought her a bowl of lemons someone had coaxed out of a tree under glass, and she sat and peeled one and ate it and thought of a little house in a warm place and how the warm places sometimes hide very cold rooms. She slept sometimes curled against Drogon's foreleg and woke with scale patterns pressed into her cheek, and laughed, a rusty sound that turned into something cleaner with practice. She thought of children, and that thought was not a wound. Arya went west once, because she had always wanted to know what was there. She found water and a wind that did not care about the names men had given continents. She found a little island where birds nested and no human had ever bothered to be cruel. She stayed 2 nights and then returned because having known there is a horizon is sometimes enough. She came back to the north and stood at the heart tree and touched the bark and did not expect it to give her anything. Sometimes it did anyway. She kept the broken dagger at her belt, and it made a noise when she ran because it had become part of the way the world knew where she was. Tyrion wrote a charter. It was boring. It was a document about wheat. It was also about how men should treat power when it had been broken open and shown to be a nest of snakes. He forced lords to listen to him talk about millers and about the rights of boys to eat and about the way women might own property in perpetuity when their husbands were dead. He drank less. He looked out windows and did not always think of jumping. Sam finished a book and began another. He wrote the story of a winter that had sat as a king and of the people who had learned how to uncrown it without replacing it with themselves. He did not give it a title. He put it on a shelf and lit a candle and stood looking at the light until Gilly came and blew it out and told him to come to bed. He did, because that is a kind of wisdom too. There would be other winters. There always are. They would come without blue eyes, and with them, they would come with the old patience and with new speed. People would sit in chairs and would try to make their weight mean more than their legs. People would burn old symbols and would build new ones, and old men would whisper that their symbols were better. A child would learn his letters and then her letters and then someone else's letters and would teach someone else theirs. The sea would continue to make rude jokes with the land. Birds would shit on statues. Bread would rise in ovens and fall when someone slammed a door. Somewhere a girl would take a blade and hold it until it became so entirely her that she could set it down. North of the places where maps sleep, the wind still tasted of iron. In a dell where he had once walked without looking down, there were tracks of men and of deer. The deer tracks crossed the men's, and the men's did not follow. The moon came up. Ghost raised his head and howled once, quietly, just to remind the night it had company. Jon warmed his hands around a cup and looked into the steam and saw nothing worth warning him and everything still worth loving. On the beach at Dragonstone, ash shifted under a mischievous wind. It drew a suggestion of a circle and then smudged it, unwilling to be tidy. Daenerys walked there in the evening after she had sent 3 ships with grain to places they would not return from and had turned away a suitor with patience. She stooped and pinched the ash between finger and thumb. It stained her skin gray. She rubbed her fingers and watched it fall and thought, there are kings who sit, there are kings who walk. There are kings who are winter and kings who are wheat and kings who are just someone's father in a field they do not own. She wiped her hand on the hem of her dress and smiled, not because she was happy, but because the sea was making a noise like laughter. Drogon lifted his head, and in the far distance the horizon briefly changed color where a school of fish turned as one. In the throne room of a city that had known too much sitting, the dais was empty. Light came through holes where stone had shrugged off plaster. A plant had found a way into a crack and decided to make a study of it. A bird flew up the length of the hall and out again because it could. The Iron Throne was a lake of dull metal that would not be a chair again. Someone would find a way to make it into plows, into spoons, into nails. Someone would melt it for coin. Someone would hammer it into a hinge for a door. People would pass through that door with bread and with books and with blades and with newborns in their arms and with the dead on their shoulders. Winter had taken the Iron Throne, and winter had been taken from it. What remained was what always remains after kings and after snow: the work. The people set to it with the doggedness of those who understand that no one is coming to save them and that the saving is theirs to do, of those who have stood in a hall while ash fell and known, at last, the precise weight of their own hands. Work takes on the shape of the hands that do it. In King's Landing they did it with raw palms and bent backs, and the city learned their shapes again. The thaw melted as a morning does, with reluctance and with a few bold patches that became infectious. The streets that had been glass grew rutted, then muddy with the complicated footprints of living men and women. The Red Keep looked less like a crown and more like a broken tooth. Smoke came up from cook fires as if a new species of vine had decided to climb the air. Davos Seaworth set a woman to bread in an oven he had bullied back to life with bricks and curses. "Don't wait for the top to look done," he told her when she hesitated and fiddled with her apron. "The bottom's where the lying starts. Tap it with your knuckle. If it rings, it's bread and you can stop watching it." On another street, an old man with more bluntness than teeth showed a boy how to turn ash into lye and lye into soap. What passed for the city watch walked without sneers. There were too few faces to risk losing any from spite. A cart with a sailcloth roof pulled bodies from a cellar and its driver saluted as he went by, a habit built when all honor had to live in smaller gestures. Tyrion Lannister took a stool by a map that had been burned into a table years ago and had recently been scorched again by a cooking pot. He did not loom. He was not capable of looming. He listened to petitions that had forgotten to call themselves that. "We need casks that don't leak," a cooper said, hat in hands, eyes on the grain. "We need something worth putting in casks," the cooper's neighbor said, not unkindly. "We need roofs," a woman with a scar across one eyebrow added. "And no soldiers pissing where the bread is needed." "No one pisses where the bread is needed," Tyrion said, "because rules signal that someone is paying attention. If they do, the nearest wall will be introduced to their head." He looked to where Missandei leaned with a slate on her lap. She had a way of making lists that turned chaos into a sequence. Casks, grain, thatch, water carts, soap. He paused. "And a bell ringer who will alert us when the next fire decides to arrive without invitation." Missandei's chalk whispered across slate. "Yara's ships are 3 days out with barley," she said. "The Prince of Dorne has promised dates and wine, which is food if you are Dorne." Her mouth moved with a humor that knew it was a tool and not a habit. "Storm's End's granaries are firm. Gendry Baratheon wrote as much with a blot that makes it look like he stabbed the page." "Good," Tyrion said. "We shall serve the blot first. Men respect a man who bleeds ink." He looked up and caught a child's gaze. The boy had stuck his head in the doorway and was caught between fear and hunger. Those twin counselors. Tyrion crooked a finger. "2 loaves for him," he told the woman with the scar, and her eyebrow flexed without softening. "1 for his mother," he added, and the boy's shoulders dropped their armor. On the 4th morning, the dragon shadow fell across the square as a cloud shaped like intention. People flinched with a muscle memory the body takes time to dismiss, then steadied. Drogon sat down outside the melted husk of the throne room with the chuff of a smith's bellows, eyes slit against the glare off water. Daenerys climbed down in a coat that had known a dozen snows and none of them southern. She walked with her hands bare, despite the cold in the stone, and there was dirt under her nails from Dragonstone's gardens. She did not look upward at the holes in the roof where gulls had started tentative conversations about nest building. She looked at people. "Queen," someone said, because words lag behind history. "No," she said, with a steadiness that had taken work. "Not now. Not here. I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, and I have brought a ledger and a dragon. The ledger will be used first." She said it in a voice pitched to carry. The hall caught it and made it a civic fact. Grey Worm came behind her with a gesture that placed 4 unsullied like commas in the space. They turned attention into grammar. "No one takes without counting," he told a man with a loot sack look. "We count for a reason. We count so as to give again." Missandei set down the slate and lifted another, the lists for the day. She had begun to write names on them rather than marks of cargo. Names reminded people that the grain had come from someone, that the cask had been bound by a cooper who would like to be asked after his daughter's cough. Tyrion raised his cup in a dry salute to the spectacle of the woman who had once imagined a golden chair now demanding salt, rope, and barrels. "If we keep this up long enough," he told Davos when the smuggler came, smelling of boat and brine, "we may accidentally invent good government. We'll muff it where we can," Davos agreed. "In the meantime, the Bae's a bastard. She's thawing patchy. I'll take Yara's grain through her teeth if I have to, but don't ask me to smile while I'm at it." "Wouldn't dream of it," Tyrion said. "Let your face rest. It has suffered enough crimes." He wrote letters that evening by ugly light. One went north with a rider whose horse breathed steam hard enough to look like a locomotive. One went east with a merchant whose eyes twitched profit even when he was sleeping. One went west with a sailor who would throw it at a dock in Pike and then drink until the next wind. The letters did not ask. They invited. He used the word council as if it were an old friend and not a thing that had usually meant a room where powerful men listened to the sound of their own voices. Sansa Stark received hers at the high table in the Eyrie where she had chosen to sit that season because the passes had decided to punish poor travelers. She read it once and then turned it over and ran her finger along the front. Where Tyrion had written her name like an apology, he did not intend to retract. Yohn Royce looked at the seal and grunted. "He wants words," he said. "The city wants food. The rest of us want a plan that ends with the winter dead and our boys alive." "The winter is dead," she said, and the way she said it made him glance at the heart tree planted in the courtyard beyond the window. "And plans do not end. They hand the next plan a cup of something warm and a chair. This one suggests Storm's End. Gendry's Hall," Yohn mused. "He's a lad with arms like a smith and an accent that still apologizes." "He stood his wall," Sansa replied. "He has bread. He will have to learn how to share." She folded the letter, slid it under a weight shaped like a gull. "We go. Send men to the mountain paths. I don't want news late just because it decided to snow." The letter to Dorne reached Sunspear warm as a secret. The prince, elected by a council in a courtyard under orange trees, because Dorne had always enjoyed being contrary about how it kissed power, read it and smiled with lips that had known worse. "A council," he said to Arianne Martell's cousin. "If this was a story that chose to admit names, but this one did not." "We like councils," he said instead. "When they happen somewhere else and when we bring our own chairs." Dorne sent riders who wore loose cloth despite the chill that had crept into even their blood, and they took salt and dates and a dozen stories about sand that would someday make northern children unreasonably happy. Yara Greyjoy laughed over Tyrion's letter on the deck of a ship that had learned to go sideways between floes and blow spray into the faces of the cold. "He likes the sound of his mouth," she told her first mate. "Fine. We'll bring him casks with barley and our poorest wine, and we'll eat their stew and pinch someone's purse to restore our balance. And if he prates at me about breaking a wheel, I'll break one of his barrels to show him how it's done." She wiped salt off her lips with a sleeve and shouted at a boy to duck before the boom did what booms have always done to boys who do not duck. She cut tangles out of rope with her knife and sang to herself in her head. Edmure Tully read his By the Fire at Riverrun with a face that tried to arrange itself into a lord's and succeeded only when he was not being watched. "A council in a southern castle that used to be my father-in-law's enemy," he said, making a stanza of it. "Why not? Take a guard. Take sensibility. Take humor. Take none of your banners. People get confused when they see banners and start thinking in the old ways." He looked at the river and the river looked back, having seen Tullus become very serious men and then forget how. At storm's end, the wind blew through arrow slits with a note half flute, half mockery. Gendry was on the wall with his hammer because it felt stranger to him to be without it than with, and because the men looked more settled when they could point at a thing and say, "There, that's the Lord's weapon." He read the letter once, lips moving, and then he took it to Brienne of Tarth, who had established herself as a coffer of steadiness within the hall. "They want to come," he said, honest about the part of him that thrilled and the part that recoiled, "to sit and talk and weigh." He scratched at his beard with soot under the nails. "I have barley, and men who don't like sleeping strangers breathing near them. But I can make a long table and I can set a guard between the table and the bedchambers." Brienne had Jaime's page in a ledger on a stand by the window. It was not the White Book. The White Book had been lost under the frosts of a world that had stopped making room for the names of Kingsguard. But she had written the words from memory, which is a kind of defense stronger than iron when the iron is gone. She had written, "He armed the woman he loved with a sword of Valyrian steel and told her she was a knight. He died standing, as he had once sworn he would, in front of a throne that had taken much and returned little." She had stopped there and let the ink dry and had not turned the page, as if the act of turning would write something she was not ready to know. "He has invited me to speak as if my voice were worth more than my sword," she said now with a puzzlement she did not attempt to hide. "He is correct about one of those things, and I suspect he knows it." She placed a hand on the page to keep it from fluttering in the draft. "We will have to keep the door between the guests and the garrison shut with more than a bar." She thought of Podrick, who came and went like spring weather, carrying jests that landed without malice and small, necessary truths. "We will need someone to stand in the passage who makes men think twice about becoming fools." "I'll stand there," Gendry said, and meant it, and she smiled without showing teeth. They came under skies that could not decide their weather, and storm's end took them as stone takes wind, with endurance that looks like indifference and is actually compassion. The main hall had a table that had once been filled by boar and laughter, and was now filled by parchments and candles and bowls of stew that had been thickened by barley until it could be cut. Tyrion took his place with an air that said both, "This is where I am intended to be," and also, "Do not trust any man who looks so certain about such things." Yara sat with her feet spread the way a sailor does. Her hand lay on her knife like a cat on a sun-warmed sill. The Prince of Dorne brought a woman with gold rings at her ankles who said nothing and reported everything with her eyes. Edmure beamed and then tried to arrange his face into gravitas again. Robin Arryn flapped the sleeve of a coat his maester had fretted over and bored a hole through with a twig when the hall bored him. Jon Royce sat behind him and made his presence a vault door. Sansa came with a cloak like a raptor's back and a gaze that made men measure their plates against their neighbors and adjust their greed by a notch. Davos in the corner became part of the furniture until he chose to speak, and then his voice cut without flourish. Sam set notes in little stacks and fiddled with the edges as if tidiness could coax clarity out of men. Grey Worm stood and did not sit and understood the way currents move in rooms. Missandei wrote, translating tone into mark. Daenerys stood until they had all found their chairs and then sat, deliberately, in a place that was not the head of the table. Jon took the seat opposite her and made of his posture a refusal to play at pageant. He always did the right thing with his back and only later worked out how the right thing would be punished. They ate first because men's minds are fools when their stomachs are empty. Then Tyrion arranged the air with his hands as if conducting a chorus of ravens. "We cannot pretend the chair in the south still sits," he said. and the glance he cut to Daenerys had respect and a thread of apology. It is a puddle and a legend. We can campaign for a legend. Many have. It has put coins and songs in people's pockets. But my proposal is bread. A confederation, Sam added, because he felt the need to make plain names. Not a crown that insists it is heavier than the people under it. Pact. A new pact. The old one bound men and the children and kept the forest from being cut to air and the men from being cut to meat. We do not have the children to witness this, unless we are wrong about the world. But we have the memory of trees and of a winter that thought it was a king. Sansa's hands lay neat on the table, the fingers of one touching the fingertips of the other like two cousins polite at a wedding. "The North will not kneel," she said in a tone that made it sound like she was discussing mathematics. "We have learned the price of kneeling, and it is always higher than the men who ask for the kneel will admit. But we do not intend to be rude in our stand. We will ally. We will share when we have bread and ask when we do not. We will send men when there is a common storm. We will keep ours when there is a snow that must be faced alone." Yara's grin showed a sailor's indifference to inland manners. The islands never gave a piss about crowns unless the crown was gold and poorly guarded. We'll be the rocks we've always been. You want ships? Ask and pay. You want raiders? Ask and pay more. You want peace on the Mander? Give us something worth tying our oars up for. She lifted her cup. "If the pact leaves my boats mine and my choices mine, I'll sign your parcham. And even spell my name right. The Vale will attend," Yohn Royce said. He did not look at his charge, who was counting the knots in the table's edge and losing track at 12 and being annoyed by that fact. "We owe the North bread and the Riverlands a watch on our road. Harrenhal is a ruin not fit for men. Storm's End is almost polite. We can host once the pass is clear. The Eyrie has its own laws, and those laws do not permit boys to be starved by uncles any longer. The Riverlands have had too many banners stitched and unstitched across our fields," Edmure said, making a brave show of ignoring the little quirk Tyrion's mouth made at the word banners. "We want fish and forgiveness. We will send what we have. We will accept what sense dictates." Dorne took a grape from a bowl and rolled it between two fingers until its skin shone. "We are tired of being told what the rest of you think civilization is," the prince said mildly. "We have our civility. It includes letting girls own their own hair and their own heat. It includes telling the faith to sit in its corner and sing if it must and to leave our bodies out of it. If your pact admits we do not need your permission, we will attend your councils and bring sweet wine you will pretend not to like." "The Reach needs a gardener," Davos said. "Pardon me. I'm a smuggler with a smuggler's tongue. Your Tyrells are gone. Your Tarleys are a question mark that looks like a sword with its head cut off. And your small folk are planting without a lord to tell them when to turn the soil. Perhaps that is better. Perhaps not. In either case, someone will have to decide whose granaries keep what when the next grasshoppers arrive. Melissa Tarley rules her hall with a willow switch." Sam put in before the conversation wandered the edge of his father's ghost. "And there is old grain in barns by Cider Hall and Uplands. I know because I once had to hide behind such barns. We can send riders. We can ask. The Reach is always rich enough to pretend poverty if it sells a better bargain." Tyrion let the voices climb and fall and then took them up again. "We must decide where this pact is sworn," he said. "We went to a tree and found winter there before. We can go to water and find boats. I propose we go back to the Isle of Faces and sign our names under its leaves. Either we will have witnesses we can trust, or we will have the knowledge that the knowledge of witnesses was once a thing the world believed in." Gendry coughed because speaking in this company felt like interrupting a sermon, and he had not liked sermons since the age of 10. "Storm's End will feed you before you go," he said. "And I'll come, with a hammer, if the trees ask me to defend myself." He looked at Daenerys, aware of the odd will the world had turned him on. A bastard whose father had been a hammer, now a lord whose hand was still more callous than skin. "You once told men you could make them what they were named. Do you still?" He stopped because she had already nodded. "I name you Baratheon," she said, not as queen, not as a woman pressing her will upon a room, but as a woman with the authority of having survived herself. You are lord of the Stormlands because the Stormlands do not dispute you, and because the only other who would was turned to ice and then to water and then to earth. You will make of the stag something less prone to dining on its own." He flushed, and it made him look more like a boy than he ever liked. Brienne's mouth made a minute bend, the sort of expression she kept for moments when the world had done a small thing exactly and probably right. They traveled under a sky that had remembered how to make clouds into sheep, to the lake that holds the Isle of Faces like a pearl. The water had not taken a skin because the trees would not tolerate it. Boats skimmed with a hush that made men want to lower their voices. They landed where the roots made a wharf and the leaves made a roof, and the faces, cut and grown over, watched with the same indifferent concentration of a mother's before she has decided whether the child is in fact her problem. They signed. The pact was not pretty. It did not sing. It had clauses about bread and about the number of men a lord might call for before his neighbors had the right to tell him to sit down. It had a section about ships that pleased Yara, a line about girls that made the Prince of Dorne touch his grape to his forehead like a sign, paragraphs about roads and the obligations of those who used them that made Davos nod as if someone had remembered to call the tide by its proper name. Sam's hand cramped twice, and Missandei finished 2 lines with a precision that made the letters look like they had been carved rather than written. Tyrion, when it came his turn to sign, paused and then wrote Lannister with a mix of honesty and defiance, as if daring the room to decide the word was a threat. Sansa signed Stark and did not tremble, and saw, out of the corner of her eye, a leaf stir when no wind moved. They did something else when the pact was done and the ink had dried in the cool. They dug. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was the work of men with spades and women with hands that had learned how to ease roots. They planted small trees from the far north, blue-green fir, 9 of them in a row along the lake's edge. "For each realm that stands under this," Tyrion said, "and one for the ones to come." He leaned on a spade and caught his breath because his back is a bougie and less charitable than his mouth. "We will not cut them down. If one falls, we will note which it was and which of us failed at our end of a bargain." "Sentiment?" Yara snorted, and then went to carry water with a grim focus that turned sentiment into something else. Jon let his palm rest against a trunk. He did not expect the rush of leaves or the voice of a boy. The silence he received did not disappoint him. He had learned to let silence be an answer. "We will need men," he said later by a small fire at the water's edge. "Not for a wall this time, for a seam. The cold will remember the way it came and go softly along it. There will be places where it will try to sit again and be a small king. We can't allow that." "Then make your order," Sansa told him. "Call it what you like. Men need names to tell them what to be faithful to. The watch has fallen. It can be made into something else. Not a watch of celibates who pretend the world will always provide sons of other men," Davos said, poking the fire with a stick. "A watch of neighbors who take their turn at the fence." Jon looked at the water and saw his face there, and for once the sight did not drag at him. "The Bound," he said. "Men of the Bound. Women too. Older boys. Older girls. Those who take a season to walk the seam and send word when it shifts. No castles. Huts. Sheds. Towers where the hills allow. No oaths that take the rest of your life. Only the oath that gives a winter to the rest of it when called." Tormund, who had turned up as if somebody had hung a flag only he could see, barked a laugh. "Aye, and we'll call the first house on the seam Jon's Folly and drink in it when the wind tries to shift it off the edge." He clapped Jon on the back hard enough to make the Bound's founder cough into his cup. "We'll teach the Kneelers how to make shoes out of bark and how to chew birch when the stew's mean, and they'll teach us how to pretend we like rules, and together we'll shout at the sky when it forgets whose turn it is." They raised the Bound with no pageantry and all seriousness. Letters went out, not from King's Landing because there was no longer a thing called the capital to dictate, but from Storm's End and from Winterfell's ruins and from White Harbor's piers and from the Ares postern gate and from a small round room in Sunspear where the heat made ink thin. "Come, walk. Learn the sound of ice in earth and what it means when foxes move early and when a river coughs." Men came with boots and a willingness to be bored and brave in the same afternoon. Women came with baskets and knives and a posture that promised to hit anyone who tried to make the baskets a joke. Boys came because boys always do when there's a chance for a better story. Girls came because someone needed to keep the boys from falling through ponds. John went out with them for the first circuit because he refused to ask for what he would not do, and because he feared what the bound might become without a hand that knows both mercy and its refusal. Ghost ran a curve along the pack, flanks rippling. He would not be taught any routes that did not suit him. They set mileposts where the seam hummed loudest, piles of stones under flags made of sailcloth stitched with the simple shape of a line knotted in the middle. They taught villagers to watch the flags without superstition. If the cloth lifted in a wind that the face did not feel, send word by elder or by child. "It's only the cold remembering itself," John said to an old woman with juniper smoke in her hair and 3 missing teeth. "But memories can be coaxed to sleep again if you catch them early." In the months that followed, the bound found thaw that had stalled and coaxed it with brush fires and hard stamping. They found ponds that had frozen at the bottom and left a pocket of air between water and ice where the fish lay like coins in a dead man's purse. They broke those pockets to let air breathe and saw the fish shoot for the hole and laughed the laugh that comes when children remember what play is for. They found a place where a corner of blue had refused to melt in the face of heat and prayer both. John sat by it at dusk and listened. He heard a crackling, the sound of a glass being turned in a hand by someone making up their mind. He stood. He crossed the last steps with care, as one approaches a horse that has been whipped too often. He set Longclaw's tip to the blue and made a line across it no deeper than a fingernail. The sound it made when it gave up its stubbornness was not relief. It was a particular kind of agreement. Grey Worm watched the bound with approval. He did not give voice. Grey Worm watched many things with approval or displeasure and said little. He had lived too long under men who made speeches. He drilled his Unsullied not for war, not exactly, but for presence. Men who can stand where men want to panic are worth money. He set them to guard storehouses and to teach boys the proper way to stack sacks so the bottom ones do not rot first. He sent 1/3 of his men to Noth with 𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒉 when the thaw had made a promise he trusted. 𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒉 returned to her island with the fear one feels when one brings fire back to a house that has not seen it in a long time. The butterflies lifted out of the palms like scraps of painted cloth. On the shore they set a camp. "We will not go inland," Grey Worm told his men. "We will help the Nothi build walls at the beach and boats at the waterline. We will fish and give the fish away and eat our bread separately. We will not bring our sickness into their shade." He had been told once that Noth killed foreigners with a fever its butterflies brought. He did not believe stories until they intersected with discipline. "We will never outrun our past," he told 𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒉 one midnight when the surf made a long, low sound like a bow on a viola. "But we can decide which direction we face when it looks at us. I will teach children songs," she said, not to contradict him but to put a different duty next to his. "I will teach them to count. I will teach them to translate their own names into other mouths and not be ashamed. I will teach them to write the word no." He curled his hand around her wrist. He did not try to lighten what she had said. He had learned from her the dangerous power of a word that draws a line. Brienne at Storm's End wrote another hand onto Jamie's page. She added fact to fact and then did something she had not intended. She wrote feeling. He kept a promise in the snow because he had been a boy who understood what a promise is for. She added in smaller script in the margin, and then put the quill down and walked until the wind took heat from her cheeks. Podrick was in the yard with a boy who could not find his balance with a sword and helped him find it not with words about honor but with a tip about knees and how the ankle speaks to the hip. "Like dancing," Pod said, and when the boy looked at him like he had been offered a brothel, he laughed kindly and set the boy's foot back where it had been a moment before. "Will you stay until the barley comes in?" Gendry asked Brienne one evening when the hall smelt of stew and pine. He knew the question was foolish. Men make foolish questions with the full knowledge of their shape because asking gives a body the chance to test its own edges. "I will go where the work is," she answered. "There will be work here for a season. Then there will be work somewhere else. Perhaps even work that doesn't require a sword." She looked at his hands and at the way he set his cup down with the delicacy of a man who has built things that broke because hands were careless. "Storm's End will be a place for a while, Gendry," she said gently. "And then it will be a place again after that. Place is something that needs tending as much as people do." Arya went west and sent a raven back that said simply, "Water, birds, and a mountain the color of rust." Then she turned her ship because west was a word with fewer answers than she expected, and because there were men with knives in the east too, and she has always preferred to pick fights with knives she can see. She returned to the Riverlands and took 3 steps into a barn where a man had been using the chaos of thaw as cover to collect girls the way a fool collects coins and hides them in his boots. She left 3 steps later. The dagger's crack made a whisper in the straw. The girls left with a woman from a village further downriver where the pact had given a stiff old lady enough permission to raise her chin and her voice. "You come to mine," the old lady said, and the girls did. And the old lady showed them bread and then showed them how to make it themselves. In King's Landing, plows were made out of swords. A boy discovered that a melted piece of the old throne makes a spine that does not set as quickly as ordinary iron, and brought the news to a smith who laughed until he understood what he had been given and then stopped laughing because reverence is an odd craftsman's habit. The faith found its footing with a new high septon who had very little interest in power and a very great interest in blankets. He preached in the morning and counted onions in the afternoon and told men to go home twice for every once he told them to kneel. The brothels reopened and their owners came to a council Missandei called for just them and left with a list of rules about cleanliness and price and privacy that made the city girls put a gold coin in a bowl under a shrine and nod to the carved mother without any irony. Tyrion built a council that did not call itself small. It met when it had to. It did not assume it knew what Winterfell needed. It sent questions north and took the answers as law. When a man from the Westerlands demanded to know why a Lannister was not building the new roads in the city, Tyrion took him to a spot where a street narrowed and water ran and said, "Listen." It took the man 3 tries to hear it. Laughter that came from 2 stories up where a woman had opened a window to let heat out and had found heat outside as well. "That is the sound that matters," Tyrion said. "If you build a road that doesn't leave room for that sound, you've built a trap." He drank wine again. He drank less of it, and he chose the evenings for it the way a soldier chooses his boots. He took the cup out onto a balcony and considered throwing it once, then did not because broken glass in the court makes work for the boys who will have to sweep it in the morning. He wrote to his brother and then stopped writing, and then wrote again without any hope that anyone would read and answer. "You died as you had to," he wrote. "I am trying to live the same way." Sam became a maester without a chain, because the chain he had wanted to earn had belonged to an order that had lost its city and its lamp and its courtesy to the living. He wore instead a wool scarf Gilly knit that was blue and gray and green because she had been taught by a woman from the Reach who had practical opinions about thread. He took boys into a room and taught them the difference between one kettle of lye and another, and then he taught them to read, and then he read them a story about a boy and a dog that had nothing to do with kings. He finished his book about winter without giving it a title, and he put it on a shelf and did not say he had done so for anyone to find. Gilly scolded him for leaving it where mice could chew, and he moved it to a box with cedar chips and came to bed, warmed by her mutterings, which had become to him as important as any oath. Sansa went north. She did not go by the King's Road because the King's Road had become an idea with a puddle at one end and a wall's ghost at the other. She went by smaller roads that took her through farms that had learned to stand when the trees twitched. She stopped at a house where a girl with sleeves too short for her arms held a loaf of bread and looked surprised that Sansa wanted to eat it. "You will be paid," Sansa told the girl's mother without offense. "And you will be asked for more if you can spare it. And if you cannot be spared from, you will be left alone and given." She added, "Because both clauses must always come together, or else they will find lovers and betray you." She walked Winterfell's ruins and did not make a sound. She knelt in the godswood at a trunk that had been scorched and touched it, and then stood and issued an order that a sapling be brought from the isle, one of the 9 new ones, because trees do not hold grudges if you ask them earnestly to become a place again. The free folk crossed the seam with baskets and with stubbornness and moved back again. Tormund returned south with more orphans and more lies and found himself sitting at a table with a woman from the Ram's Horn who had never been farther than the nearest winter market. They married without telling anyone, and the first anyone knew of it was when the woman shouted at him in front of the Bound's hut for leaving his boot in the doorway where it would trip a child. "That's how I like it," Tormund confided to Jon later with a badly hidden softness. "If she stops shouting, I'll start worrying." Jon rode the circuit until his face became the Bound's face. He wore no sigil but a line knotted in the middle on a strip of cloth stitched to his shoulder. He sent letters to Winterfell, to Storm's End, to Dragonstone, letters that read more like weather than politics. "The river at 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒉 today," one read, and Sansa sent a note back that said, "I hear you and have sent men. I have also sent my thought. Do not forget to eat." He went to the Isle of Faces alone once and put his palm to the bark and said a name he had not allowed his mouth to say in months. The leaves moved. He did not hear a voice. He felt a silence shift and accept the name into itself, the way a lake takes a stone and keeps its ripples without making a fuss. Daenerys did not come to the council every time it met. She went where the ledger took her. She went to a field where women were arguing over whose oat was whose and set a measure between them that made both of them swear, which is how you know it has been done right. She went to a harbor where a man had been skimming 2 fish an hour from other men's nets, and gave him a job skimming 2 fish an hour for the city instead, with a ledger and a lash behind it. She learned how to speak to men who had built their lives on the fragile lie of being necessary. She told a man from Old Town that his library had burned and that he would have to build another one with his hands and the hands of his students. When he told her he was not a builder, she said, "You are now," and ordered timber. She walked at night on Dragonstone's beach and spoke to Drogon as if he were a priest. He answered by blowing salt at her and making his pupil so big she could see herself in it, small and stubborn. She and Jon met at the Bound's house near the neck after a year of work. They did not touch. They exchanged news as if exchanging knives. Missandei writes that the butterflies leave the unsullied alone, she said, and smiled, surprised, as if the world had decided a rumor should be kind for once. They fish and build and stand where the men who would take Noth see them and turn their eyes elsewhere. "The river gave up its breath today," Jon replied. "I thought for a moment I heard someone laugh in it. Then I remembered it was me. It made me uncomfortable." He reached to scratch Ghost, and the wolf closed his eyes and butted his head into the hand, reminding both of them of simpler economies. "Do you still?" She knew what he was asking and spared him the flinch. "I do not sit," she said. "I did once in my imagination. It made me cruel. Now I stand until I can sit by the fire like anyone else. It has made me many unflattering things. It has also made me useful." He nodded. Being useful is a way to cheat despair. He looked out at a line of trees and made himself not count them, because counting can become a religion that does not end in grace. "We will grow old," she said, with the curiosity of someone to whom the idea had always been literature. "We will watch children learn to be rude on purpose. We will have fewer dragons and fewer kings and many more petitions about bridges that do not meet in the middle. We will have snow," he said, "and then we will have mud, and then we will have grass." He looked at her, and for a heartbeat the distance between them looked like something a man could step across if he chose to risk falling. He did not. That, too, is a kind of vow. The years went on in their careful way. The pact held not because it was fragile, but because it had been made with enough ugly clauses to keep men from pretending it was beautiful. It held because men like Davos went out on mornings that mayors and lords had decided were for rest and counted sacks of grain. It held because women like Missandei, like Sansa, like Brienne, like Arya and Gilly, and the ones who will never make it into anyone's book, rose before dawn and told other women where to put their hands to make bread rise and boys' tempers fall. It held because Grey Worm stood in a doorway and a thief decided it would be less work to be honest. It held because the Bound kept walking and because men learned to feel the difference between a cold that means night and a cold that means trouble. There were failures. There were floods in the Riverlands that took 3 villages away and made a new tributary that cartographers cursed and fishermen blessed. There was a fever in White Harbor that took a half-dozen children and one woman who would have been a very fine baker, with a way of scoring loaves as if she were writing letters to the morning. There was a raid along the Mander, freebooter men who had missed their winter and were craving the old work. And Yara hung 2 of them from a gallows on her own deck and fed the rest to their own hunger with a lecture and stale bread. There was a man in the Crownlands who declared himself king of a hamlet and put a bronze pot on his head and made 5 people kneel. He was removed from his pot with the same caution one uses with a hot pan, and Daenerys assigned him to break rocks in a quarry for a season, and when he did it well she told him, "You are not a king, you are a mason." And he took the word and made it the shape of his year. On a spring afternoon that felt like a story about spring and not like spring itself, Sansa sat in a rebuilt hall at Winterfell with the sapling from the Isle stretching itself into youth outside the window. She had a visitor whose cloak smelled of ash and salt and whose hair had thinned. Tyrion Lannister stood by the hearth and held his hands to the heat in a way he did not realize looked like prayer. "I brought you a book," he said without preamble, and held out a parcel. She opened it and found a ledger, not of grain, not of ships, but of the pack's own seasons. Missandei's writing on the first pages, precise as ever. Sam's on later ones, meandering into the margins, covering mistakes with the skill of a man who knows he will make many and who has learned to forgive them. Tyrion had added notes in a cramped hand, some acerbic, some unexpectedly tender. "I thought," he said, "we should have an account that does not pretend to poetry. I fear the poets will come anyway." "They always do," she agreed, and placed the book on a shelf that had been made for it the week she had ordered the pact. "You look like a man who has come because he can." "I am a man who has come because the road allowed," he said. "Forgive me. I am in love with roads this year. So often they go where they said they were going to. It is a relief to be able to trust any promise, even one made by stones." They walked the inner wall despite the chill that had become a habit of the North without rudeness. "No desire to be a queen?" he asked, and earned a glance that would have hurt a younger Tyrion more than it did now. "I am queen enough," she said. "Titles bore me, the work does not. A queen's ribbon is a poor thing next to a kitchen's ledger. I will take the ledger." He raised his hands as one shields against a well-earned rebuke. "I only ask because I have used the word too often for women who deserved better than my sentence." He adjusted his gloves. "You're good at this," he said simply. "So are you," she surprised him by answering. "You get in your own way less than you used to. I can still be relied upon to drink too late and make a joke where a kindness would have done," he said. "But I am trying to let the joke come second." He watched a boy carry a basket of kindling. "Do you miss him?" "Yes," she said. "As one misses a storm once it has gone. It is easier to walk. It is less easy to feel." She touched the stone with gloved fingers. "The quiet is not always kind. Then we had better find ways to fill it," he said. "Preferably with bread and laughter that does not bite." Summer came, then went untidily, with rain that arrived 2 weeks late and made the barley plump in apology. The Bound found less to do and took up repairs to their own huts. They built a watchtower halfway between the Dreadfort's old shadow and the White Knife. They called it the Knot and carved a simple symbol into its lintel. Jon came less often because the seam did not need his presence to remember itself. He took a boy with him one day to the lake at the Isle and showed him how to scull without splashing and how to listen for birds that know a weather you do not yet know. The boy asked if the trees were gods, and Jon said, "They are older than our words for gods. Treat them as you would a man who might save you if you keep your voice down." Grey Worm returned from Noth for a season with quiet in his shoulders. He stood for a long time on Dragonstone's beach, watching a line where the sea wrote and unwrote its sentence. Missandei sat beside him and told him the names of children born in his absence, all of them with 2 names, one Nothi, one taken from some other place where a kindness had been done. "We made a school," she said. "They asked for it after we had shown them we would not make them take it. They are better than we are. That makes the work easier." "You will go back," he said. It was not a question. "I will," she answered, "and I will come again. If I do not, I expect you to protect them in the old way with the new wisdom." "It will be done," he said, and believed it, which made the promise a building and not a song. On an autumn night when the sea threw itself at Dragonstone with a toddler's tantrum and the torches gilded the hall's damp stones, Daenerys took the ledger down and weighed it in her hands. She had been so angry once at the shape of the world that her anger had set the shape she made in it. Now she was only occasionally angry, and she saved it for men who insisted a lapse in the old ways was a law of nature and not a choice. She set the book down and let her fingers rest on the cover, then lifted her head at the sound of feet on the stair. "Your Grace," Tyrion said by habit and then stopped himself. "Daenerys," he corrected, and the correction cost him nothing now. He held out a cup. "The wine is reach pretend," he apologized. "It tastes as if it has been promised more than it contains." "That is much of the reach," she said, and took the cup for the courtesy of it. "What do you need?" Because with Tyrion there is always a need, and it is usually not his. "To tell you that you can stop." He gestured at the ledger. "For a night, for a month if you choose. The pact walks without you sometimes now. That is how we will know it has become culture and not a particularly successful trick." He lifted his own cup and did not drink. "I am increasingly convinced I am less required than I enjoy feeling. That is the terrible news good men must swallow," she said. "That they have made themselves unnecessary in the best way." She set the cup down untasted. "Come to the roof," she said. "The wind is less rude when it can get at you properly." They climbed. Drogon lay above, his breath steaming in a rhythm that was nearly comfort and nearly reminder. The stars stood in their ironwork. Tyrion leaned his elbow on the parapet and rubbed his eyes. "Do you ever think," he asked, "about the throne? The chair? The iron? I am deliberately not asking if you regret." "I think of it as one thinks of a bad lover," she said, "with pity for my younger self and with relief for my older one." She looked out over the water and could not see the far shore and was content with that ignorance. "I have sat where I needed to." She smiled, a small thing sharpened by a great deal of practice. "There," she said, nodding toward the ledger lying on a table in the light below. "On that chair." He laughed. "We have written ourselves into a world that argues about casques rather than crowns. The songs will hate us. The songs can learn to love different shapes," she said, "or they can be sung only to babies, where they cannot do harm." He drank then and grimaced. "This wine is worse than confession." He turned his cup, let the liquid find its own level. "I suppose I should go back to the city before it begins imagining itself again. It always does. Someone must stand and say, 'No, you are a port and a home and a place we keep bread and scholars.' Go in the morning," she said. "If we are to cheat despair, we should permit ourselves one night's conspiracy against it." In King's Landing, a boy hammered a nail into a door that would keep out most of the rain. He did it under the eye of a man whose hair had been silver once and now was merely gone. He set the nail straight because he had learned on other doors that nails can be a map. Set them wrong and the door will speak its complaint in winter. A woman at his back measured see-through bolts of cloth against a chest where she kept things she had been told to leave behind when the cold had taken her city. She ignored those voices. She had learned who she was for herself this year. On the Bounds route, a flag lifted when no wind declared itself. A girl with arms long enough now to hold a bough stood and shaded her eyes and then put down her spoon and walked to the high pole. She felt the difference in the air as one feels the change in a room where a dinner has gone suddenly honest. She reached up and set her palm against the cloth. It was cold in a way that was a memory and not a knife. She smiled and went to fetch a man who had learned the river sounds. "It is nothing," she said when he raised his worry like a shield. "And it is everything. We need to teach each other the difference." She ran to meet Jon halfway down the path, and he took one look at her and felt the ridiculous pride men feel when they see that their trying has left marks that are not scars. He clapped her shoulder and did not make a speech. He turned instead and showed her how to set a small fire at the foot of the pole and feed it with a particular rhythm that made the air decide to choose warmth. They watched, and it worked, and they let themselves have one soft laugh before they went on. Somewhere west of the maps, the sea did a trick with light that made an island look like a coin briefly before it was a shadow again. 𝒅𝒆𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒉's ship went that way and then did not, because she had learned that the going is sometimes the point, and returning is the next sentence. She told Tormund's wife a story about a mountain the color of rust, and Tormund's wife told Arya a story about a man who had once thought he could teach ravens to count, and they laughed so hard the Bound's hut shook. In the south, on Noth, children sang a song about a butterfly that refused to carry fever and insisted on carrying words instead. Grey Worm sat on the sand and listened to a language he did not speak and heard anyway what mattered. Missandei wrote the song down on slate and sent it north with a letter that said, simply, "Sometimes the world learns." In a hall with a dais that would never hold a throne, Tyrion put a coin into a box for widows and then stood a long while without saying anything. Sansa took bread to a woman who had not asked for it. Brienne corrected a boy's elbow. Davos told a joke so rude a priest grinned. Sam mended a page. Yara kicked a man into a canal and then threw him a rope and told him he would only be allowed to climb if he promised to stop admiring himself when there was work to be done. Jon set a hand on the flagpole's knot and felt, faintly, a hum that said, "Pay attention, always, but begin this attention with kindness." It snowed once more, early in a winter that had decided to be humble. The flakes were big and sloppy and laid themselves down like cats. Ghost put his nose into them and sneezed and then barked at his own sneeze, surprised by its cheek. Jon laughed. He looked at the line of the horizon and it did not threaten him. Promised. He took a breath of air that had no memory sharp enough to cut and smelled. The way a man smells a future he has earned by forgetting to demand it. Smoke from 100 chimneys, bread from as many ovens, and the sea making its rude jokes with the land. He stood there long enough for the snow to write a line along his collar, and then he went inside, because men are not kings of snow and are allowed to warm their hands. The work went on. It took the shape of the hands that did it and, sometimes, the shape of the mouths that smiled as they spoke around it. Kings had sat. Kings had died. Winter had sat and was dead. What remained was what had been there all along, waiting for people to discover that it was, in truth, the greater glory. The daily cleverness of survival, the courtesies that become laws when repeated enough, the stubbornness that becomes culture, the unadorned oath shared between neighbors that says, "In the old law and under the new trees. I will stand when it is my turn, and when I am done, I will let you stand, and we will call the standing good."